The Ship of Theseus. Imagine a famous ancient ship displayed in a museum for centuries. Over time, its wooden parts begin to rot, so curators replace them one by one. After many years, every single original piece has been replaced. Is it still the same ship? This is the Ship of Theseus Paradox, one of the oldest and most intuitive puzzles about identity. It basically asks at what point something stops being itself when its components change. The paradox gets even better. Imagine someone collected all the original discarded pieces and reassembled them into a second ship. Now, which one is the real Ship of Theseus? This isn't just some abstract philosophical game. It's a problem we face every day. Your body replaces most of its cells every decade or so. The atoms in your brain today aren't the same ones you had as a child, yet you still consider yourself the same person. How does that work? Some philosophers focus on continuity. As long as changes happen gradually and the form is maintained, identity persists. Others say it's about function. If the reconstructed ship still sails the same way, it's the same ship. Materialists might argue that neither ship is truly original once parts are swapped. The paradox extends beyond physical objects. Consider institutions like Harvard University. After hundreds of years, it has different buildings, different professors, different students, different rules. Yet we still call it Harvard. What makes it the same institution? Is it the name, the location, the purpose, or something else entirely? Or think about your favorite band that's replaced every original member over decades. Is it still the same band? Fans might fiercely debate this, some claiming authenticity requires original members, others arguing the musical style or spirit matters more. This puzzle gets especially interesting with digital identity. If you uploaded your consciousness to a computer, would that digital entity be you? What if there were multiple copies? Would they all have equal claim to being you? The Ship of Theseus paradox reminds us that identity isn't as straightforward as we assume. We intuitively feel that things have some essential core that makes them what they are. But when pressed, this essence becomes remarkably difficult to pin down. Is identity about physical continuity, function, form, history, or something else entirely? The question remains unsettled after thousands of years of debate, suggesting the answer might say more about how humans categorize the world than about any objective reality. The Teleportation Paradox. Imagine a teleportation device that works like this. It scans your body molecule by molecule, destroys the original, and recreates an identical version somewhere else using different atoms. Every memory, every scar, every cell perfectly replicated. The new you steps out, feeling like the journey was instantaneous. But here's the disturbing question. Did you travel, or did you die and get replaced by a perfect copy who only thinks they're you? This is the Teleportation Paradox, most famously explored in philosophy by Derek Parfit and in science fiction from Star Trek to The Prestige. It cuts to the heart of what personal identity actually means. If all your physical and psychological features are perfectly duplicated, does it matter that there's no physical continuity? Is the person who steps out of the teleporter really you, or just someone exactly like you who thinks they're you? The paradox gets even weirder with variations. What if the teleporter malfunctions and fails to destroy the original? Now there are two yous with equal claim to being the authentic person. Which one is really you? Both have the same memories and think they're the original. Or what if the teleporter transmits the information but takes a week to reassemble you? Were you dead during that week, or just temporarily non-existent? Your intuitions might pull you in different directions. On one hand, physical continuity seems important. The teleporter kills you and makes a copy. On the other hand, if your copy has all your memories and personality, behaves just like you would, and feels subjectively certain they're you, what exactly is missing? Some philosophers argue that personal identity is about psychological continuity rather than physical continuity. As long as your memories, beliefs, desires, and personality traits continue in an uninterrupted chain, you persist as the same person, even if the physical substrate changes completely. Others maintain that identity requires the same physical brain, arguing that teleportation is actually death and replacement. Some take a functional approach, suggesting that if the copy functions exactly like you would have, the distinction becomes meaningless. The Teleportation Paradox reveals that our concept of personal identity isn't just fuzzy around the edges. It might be fundamentally incoherent. We want identity to be all or nothing. Either it's you or it isn't. But these thought experiments suggest identity might be more like a matter of degree, or even a practical fiction rather than a metaphysical truth. Perhaps the question, would I survive teleportation, has no simple yes or no answer in any objective sense. The grandfather paradox. What if you traveled back in time and killed your own grandfather before he met your grandmother? If you succeeded, you would never have been born. But if you were never born, you couldn't have traveled back in time to kill your grandfather. But if you didn't kill him, then you would exist and could go back to kill him. Round and round it goes in an impossible logical loop. This is the grandfather paradox, the classic time travel conundrum that's been keeping science fiction fans and philosophers awake at night for decades. While it might seem purely hypothetical, it cuts to the heart of questions about causality, free will, and the nature of time itself. Physicists and philosophers have proposed various solutions. The most straightforward is that the paradox simply proves time travel to the past is impossible. The laws of physics might ultimately forbid any mechanism that would allow you to create such a contradiction. Einstein's relativity allows for some weird time effects, but creating true paradoxes might be off the table. Others suggest the consistent timeline approach. If time travel exists, you simply cannot change the past. Something would always prevent you from killing your grandfather. Your gun would jam, you'd slip on a banana peel, or you'd have a change of heart. The past is already fixed, including any visits from future time travelers. Then, there's the multiple timelines, or multiverse solution, popularized by countless movies and TV shows. When you travel back and kill your grandfather, you create a new branch of reality, one where you were never born. But you don't disappear because you came from the original timeline where your grandfather lived. This avoids logical contradiction but raises new questions about what it means to be you across different realities. The grandfather paradox isn't just about time travel, it's about identity across time. It questions whether the you from the future is really connected to the you from the past in a coherent causal chain. If that chain can loop back on itself, does personal identity even make sense? Some philosophers see the paradox as revealing something deeper about the nature of time itself. If time isn't simply linear, but has more complex topology, perhaps personal identity is similarly complex. Maybe we're not distinct individuals moving through time, but more like four-dimensional objects stretched across our entire lifespans, with complex relationships to our past and future selves. Whether time travel ever becomes possible or remains fiction, the grandfather paradox continues to challenge our intuitions about causality, free will, and identity across time, forcing us to reconsider what it means to be the same person from one moment to the next. The Sorites Paradox. When does a person with changing traits remain the same person? This question leads us to the Sorites Paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap. It goes like this. Imagine a heap of sand. If you remove one grain, it's still a heap. Remove another, still a heap. Logic suggests you can continue this process indefinitely, removing one grain at a time, yet always having a heap. But eventually, you'll have just one grain, or even zero, clearly not a heap. So when exactly did the heap stop being a heap? This ancient Greek paradox applies perfectly to personal identity. Consider how you change over time. If you change one small belief, you're still you. Change a minor habit, still you. Alter a few memories, seemingly still you. But if this process continues, with thousands of small changes accumulating over decades, at what precise point would you stop being you? The paradox challenges our assumption that identity must be all or nothing. We want clear boundaries. Either it's the same person or it isn't. But reality seems to operate in fuzzy gradations with no clear cutoff point. This vagueness isn't a failure of language. It reflects the fundamentally continuous nature of personal change. Some philosophers embrace this vagueness, arguing that personal identity is indeed a matter of degree rather than a binary state. You can be more or less the same person over time, with no sharp boundaries. Others suggest that identity persists as long as there's enough psychological connectedness and continuity between past and present selves. What matters is the strength of these connections, not some essential unchanging core. Consider people with Alzheimer's disease. As memories fade and personality changes, family members often struggle with the feeling that their loved one is disappearing or becoming a different person. But there's no single day when this transformation definitively occurs. It's a gradual process with countless imperceptible steps. Or think about dramatic life changes. If someone has a profound religious conversion, completely transforms their values, and renounces their former life, are they the same person? What if they change their name, appearance, nationality, gender identity, and social relationships? At what point would you say they've become someone new? The Sorites Paradox suggests our concept of persistent identity might be more practical than metaphysical, a useful fiction rather than a fundamental truth. Perhaps we insist on continuous identity because it serves social and psychological purposes, not because it perfectly captures reality. This doesn't mean identity isn't real or important. Rather, it suggests identity might be more like a spectrum than a fixed essence, flexible, context-dependent, and resistant to precise boundaries. The person you are today is neither entirely identical to nor entirely different from your past self, but connected through countless threads of memory, values, and experiences that defy simple categorization. The twin paradox. Imagine you have an identical twin. On your 20th birthday, your twin boards a spaceship and travels at near light speed for what feels to them like 5 years. When they return to Earth, they're 25 years old, but you're now 50 because time dilation means 30 Earth years passed during their journey. Despite being born minutes apart, you're now separated by decades in age. Which one of you is really older? This isn't just science fiction. The twin paradox emerges directly from Einstein's theory of relativity, where time actually flows differently depending on relative velocity and gravitational fields. It reveals something profound about how identity persists through time. If time itself isn't absolute, what does that mean for our identity across time? Most of us intuitively believe in absolute age. You're as old as the time that's passed since your birth. But the twin paradox shows that time is relative. Both twins would be right about their own ages. The traveling twin has experienced 25 years of consciousness, while the earthbound twin has experienced 50. Both have followed continuous but different timelines. This gets even stranger when we consider identical twins typically share nearly identical DNA. Physically, they started almost indistinguishable, yet their different temporal experiences would now create radical differences. The earthbound twin might have grandchildren older than their space-traveling sibling. The paradox challenges our understanding of identity as continuous development through time. If developmental stages are tied to age, what happens when relativistic effects compress or stretch time? Is the 25-year-old space traveler really 50 in some absolute sense because they were born 50 years ago? Or is age fundamentally about lived experience rather than calendar time? Philosophers have long debated whether identity requires continuity through time. John Locke argued that personal identity consists in continuity of consciousness through memory. Both twins would have continuous memories from their perspective, yet they would have experienced radically different durations of existence. The twin paradox also raises questions about social identity. Much of how we understand ourselves is tied to generational experience, the defining events we lived through and when we experienced them. The earthbound twin might identify with their generation's music, politics, and cultural touchstones, while the traveling twin would miss decades of shared cultural evolution. While few of us will experience relativistic time dilation, the paradox shows that time itself, something we take for granted as the steady background of identity, is actually flexible. If time can stretch and compress, perhaps identity is similarly elastic, defined less by absolute metrics and more by the subjective flow of consciousness and experience. Your identity exists not in some absolute timeline, but in your own relative experience of duration, memory, and change. The brain transplant problem. Imagine waking up one morning to discover you're in a completely different body, not metaphorically, literally. Scientists have transplanted your brain into someone else's body while you slept. You have all your memories, personality, and thoughts, but when you look in the mirror, a stranger stares back. Who are you now? Are you still yourself, just in a new body, or have you become someone else? This thought experiment, explored by philosophers like Bernard Williams and Derek Parfit, forces us to reckon with what truly grounds our identity. Most of us intuitively feel we'd still be ourselves after a brain transplant. After all, your memories, beliefs, desires, and personality, everything that seems to make you uniquely you, would travel with your brain. From the inside, the experience of being you would continue uninterrupted. But from the outside, things get complicated. Your family might struggle to recognize you in your new body. Legally, whose identity would you claim? Would you have rights to your original body's possessions, relationships, and social security number? If your original body survived with someone else's brain, two people might claim to be the real you, one based on psychological continuity, the other on bodily continuity. This puzzle reveals a tension in our concept of personal identity. We seem to prioritize psychological continuity over bodily continuity. Most people feel they would go with their brain, but we also recognize the importance of bodily continuity in everyday identity judgments. We identify people by their faces and bodies, not by interviewing them to check their memories. The plot thickens if we consider variation. What if only half your brain were transplanted, with both halves somehow maintaining your full psychology? Would you be in two places at once? What if your brain were gradually replaced, neuron by neuron, with artificial components that functioned identically? At what point, if ever, would you cease to be you? The brain transplant problem reveals something important. Personal identity seems to rest on both psychological and physical continuity, but we struggle to articulate exactly how these aspects relate or which takes priority in borderline cases. Our intuitions pull us in different directions. Some philosophers, like Hume, suggest that personal identity might be a fiction altogether. Not in the sense that you don't exist, but that what you call you is just a bundle of perceptions without any unchanging essence. Others, like Kant, argue that some form of underlying selfhood must exist to make sense of our unified experience, even if we can't directly access it. The brain transplant problem has practical implications too. As neuroscience advances, questions about identity become increasingly relevant. If we develop brain-computer interfaces that merge minds, or the ability to upload consciousness to computers, we'll face real versions of these philosophical puzzles. The thought experiment isn't just about imaginary surgeries. It's about what grounds your existence as a continuous person through time and change. The split brain paradox. Imagine having your brain's hemispheres surgically separated so they can't communicate with each other. This isn't a mere thought experiment. It's a real procedure called corpus callosotomy, sometimes performed to treat severe epilepsy. What makes this fascinating is how it challenges our intuitions about having a single, unified consciousness. In famous studies by Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga, split-brain patients showed something remarkable. When information was shown only to the right hemisphere by presenting it to the left visual field, the left hemisphere, which controls speech, couldn't verbally report seeing it. It's as if two separate awareness systems emerged in one skull. In one striking experiment, researchers flashed the word key to a patient's right visual field, processed by the left brain, and ring to the left visual field, processed by the right brain. When asked what they saw, the patient said key, but their left hand, controlled by the right brain, pointed to a picture of a ring when asked to identify what was seen. This raises a profound identity paradox. Does a split-brain patient have one consciousness or two? If two, where was that second consciousness before the surgery? The left hemisphere can talk about its experiences, but the right hemisphere must communicate non-verbally, yet both seem aware. Are there now two subjects of experience where there was previously one? Some philosophers, like Thomas Nagel, suggest this reveals consciousness isn't as unified as we assume. Perhaps normal consciousness is already somewhat fragmented, with the corpus callosum creating an illusion of perfect unity. Maybe what we experience as a single self is actually a collection of sub-processes that usually work together seamlessly. What's particularly unsettling is how the speaking hemisphere will confabulate, make up stories, to explain actions initiated by the non-speaking hemisphere. If shown a snowy scene in their left visual field, patients might use their left hand to point to a snow shovel. When asked why, the speaking left hemisphere doesn't say, "I don't know." Instead, it invents a reason like, to clean out the chicken coop, having no access to the actual reason. This suggests our sense of being a unified self with coherent motivations might be partly constructed after the fact. Your conscious experience might not reflect the true complexity of what's happening in your brain, raising profound questions about free will and self-knowledge. If identity requires unity of consciousness, what does this mean for split-brain patients? Are they one person with a fragmented experience, or have they become two partial people sharing one body? The paradox reveals how fragile our unified conscious experience might be, suggesting our sense of self depends on physical connections we typically take for granted. The transporter malfunction problem. Imagine this scenario. You step into a teleportation device that's supposed to disassemble your atoms, transmit the information to Mars, and reassemble you there. But something goes wrong. The original you isn't destroyed, yet the Mars version is still created perfectly. Now there are two identical yous, each claiming to be the real you, each with the same memories right up to the moment of teleportation. Which one is actually you? This is the transporter malfunction problem, a thought experiment that pushes our concept of personal identity to its breaking point. Both versions have equal claim to being you. Both have your memories, personality, beliefs, and physical structure. Both feel subjectively certain they are the continuation of the person who stepped into the teleporter. Your first intuition might be that the Earth you is the real you, since there's bodily continuity, no interruption in your existence. But this contradicts the intuition many have, that regular teleportation, where the original is destroyed, preserves identity. If you think teleportation normally preserves identity, why would the continued existence of the original suddenly make the copy not you? The problem gets worse. Imagine the Earth. You is fatally injured right after teleportation, with doctors saying you'll die within a day. Meanwhile, the Mars you is perfectly healthy. As Earth you, would you take comfort in knowing that you will continue to live on Mars? Or would you face death knowing that someone else, a mere copy, will continue your life? Philosopher Derek Parfit suggests this paradox reveals something profound. Identity might not be what ultimately matters. What's important isn't whether the Mars person is really you in some binary sense, but rather the degree of psychological connectedness and continuity between you and your successors. Both versions would initially have 100% connectedness to the original you, so in what matters, they're both equally you, even though they're now distinct people whose experiences will increasingly diverge. This challenges our assumption that identity must follow an all-or-nothing logic. Perhaps there's no fact of the matter about which is really you, because personal identity doesn't work the way we intuitively think it does. Instead of asking, which one is me? The better question might be, what relation do both new people have to the original me? And what relations matter? The transporter malfunction problem isn't just philosophical navel-gazing. It connects to real questions about what grounds your concern for your future self. Why care about the person you'll be tomorrow? Not because they're identical to you, they'll be slightly different, but because of the strong psychological connections carrying forward. This insight might change how we think about caring for future versions of ourselves and others, focusing less on abstract identity and more on concrete connections. The Sleeping Beauty Problem. Imagine being part of a strange experiment. On Sunday, researchers will put you to sleep, then they'll flip a fair coin. If it comes up heads, they'll wake you once on Monday. If it comes up tails, they'll wake you on Monday, erase your memory of that awakening, and wake you again on Tuesday in a state indistinguishable from Monday's awakening. When you wake up during the experiment, what probability should you assign to the coin having landed heads? This is the Sleeping Beauty Problem, a deceptively simple scenario that has divided philosophers and mathematicians into two camps with different answers. It probes the connection between personal identity, subjective experience, and probability in puzzling ways. The thirders argue the probability is 1/3. Their reasoning: there are 3 possible awakening scenarios: Monday plus heads, Monday plus tails, Tuesday plus tails, each of which appears identical from your perspective. Since you're in one of these 3 scenarios and can't tell which, the probability of heads is 1/3. The halfers counter that the probability remains 1/2. The coin is fair, and no new information about the coin flip is provided upon awakening. From this perspective, being awakened once or twice doesn't change the objective 50-50 probability of the coin toss. What makes this an identity paradox is how it involves multiple possible yous across time and possibility. If the coin lands tails, there are 2 experientially identical awakenings, 2 subjective perspectives that can't be distinguished from the inside. Are these 2 different people? 2 stages of the same person? How should we count these experiences when calculating probabilities? The paradox deepens if we imagine the researchers creating a perfect physical duplicate of you for the Tuesday awakening rather than reusing your body. Would this change your answer? What if they created thousands of duplicates for a tails result? These variations probe whether identity is tied to physical continuity or something else. Some philosophers, like Adam Elgar, argue that your answer depends on whether you consider yourself a person who might experience multiple awakenings, or a person stage, a single subjective moment of awareness. This suggests that how we conceptualize our identity through time directly affects how we should reason about our location in possibility space. The problem connects to broader questions about anthropic reasoning, how to account for your own existence when calculating probabilities. It suggests that subjective experience and personal identity might be more relevant to certain kinds of reasoning than traditional probability theory acknowledges. Whether you're a thirder or halfer, the Sleeping Beauty Problem reveals how our concepts of identity across time and possibility remain surprisingly unsettled, with direct implications for how we reason about uncertainty in situations involving multiple possible versions of ourselves. The Swampman Paradox. Imagine you're walking near a swamp when, by incredible cosmic coincidence, a bolt of lightning disintegrates your body while simultaneously creating an atom-by-atom duplicate from swamp materials nearby. This swampman looks exactly like you, has all the same neural configurations, and behaves exactly as you would have. He walks away convinced he's you, with apparent memories of your entire life up to that moment of lightning. This thought experiment, introduced by philosopher Donald Davidson, raises a disturbing question. Is Swampman you? He certainly thinks he's you. He'll go home to your family, who won't notice any difference. He has all your apparent memories, personality traits, and behavioral dispositions. From the inside, his experience is indistinguishable from what yours would have been. But Davidson argued there's a crucial difference. Swampman's apparent memories aren't actually memories, because he wasn't there for the original events. When Swampman remembers your childhood, these aren't genuine memories, but merely brain states that happen to be structured identically to your memories. Similarly, when he recognizes your friends, he's not really recognizing them since he's never met them before. This reveals a tension in our concept of identity. On one hand, If two people are physically identical down to the last atom and have identical psychological states, it seems arbitrary to say they're different people. On the other hand, if history and causal continuity matter to identity, then Swampman isn't you, despite being your perfect physical duplicate. The paradox connects to theories of mental content. Davidson believed the meaning of thoughts depends partly on their causal history. Your thought about water means water because it was caused by interactions with actual water. By this view, Swampman's thoughts lack proper causal histories and therefore proper meaning, despite his sincere belief that he's thinking about things from his past. Some philosophers reject this conclusion, arguing that what matters for identity is psychological continuity, regardless of how it's caused. By this view, Swampman would be you because he continues your psychological life seamlessly. The Swampman scenario becomes even more puzzling if we ask practical questions. Would Swampman be morally responsible for your action? Should he be held to your promises? Does he deserve your property rights? If not, what's the relevant difference that justifies treating physically and psychologically identical beings differently? The paradox highlights a fundamental tension between physical, psychological similarity and historical continuity in our concept of personal identity. It suggests that either our intuitive concept of identity contains contradictions, or identity involves elements beyond physical and psychological states, perhaps including causal histories that aren't directly accessible to consciousness, but nevertheless matter to who we fundamentally are. The fission problem. Imagine your brain is split in half, and each hemisphere is transplanted into a different empty body. Both resulting people have enough of your brain to sustain consciousness, personality, and many of your memories. Each wakes up thinking they're you, though perhaps with some memory gaps. Here's the paradox. Which one is actually you? This is the fission problem, a thought experiment that puts extraordinary pressure on our concept of personal identity. The usual answers all seem problematic. If you say, "Neither is me," that's strange, because if we had only moved one hemisphere and destroyed the other, you'd likely agree that you survived in the remaining hemisphere. Why would creating a second person negate the identity of the first? If you say, "Both are me," you've violated the logic of identity, which typically holds that one thing can't be identical to two different things. If person A and person B are distinct from each other, they have different bodies and will lead different lives. And you are identical to both. Then, by transitivity, person A would have to be identical to person B, which they clearly aren't. If you say, "One of them is me, but not the other," you face the problem of arbitrariness. If the hemispheres are roughly symmetrical in terms of preserving your psychology, what could make one the real you and the other just a copy? Any criterion would seem arbitrary. Philosopher Derek Parfit used this paradox to argue that identity might not be what matters in survival. What's important isn't whether you survive as the same person in some strict metaphysical sense, but whether your values, memories, intentions, and psychological features continue in the future. In the fission case, these continue in both resulting people. So perhaps you have double survival, rather than becoming either one specific person or ceasing to exist. This suggests personal identity may not be as fundamental as we think. Perhaps what matters in survival isn't the strict logical identity philosophers have focused on, but psychological continuity and connectedness. You might care about future people to the extent they're psychologically connected to you, not because they're the same person in some deeper sense. The fission problem also raises practical questions. If both resulting people have equal claim to your assets, relationships, and responsibilities, how should these be divided? Should both be held accountable for your past actions? Would your loved ones have obligations to both? Some philosophers suggest we should think of personal identity in terms of the closest continuer. You survive as the future person who is most psychologically continuous with you. But in perfect fission, there is no closest continuer. Both are equally close. This paradox reveals that our intuitive concept of identity might be fundamentally inadequate for certain cases. When pushed to extremes, it breaks down, suggesting that identity might be more like a useful fiction than a deep metaphysical truth, a way of tracking psychological continuity through time that works in ordinary cases but fails in extraordinary ones. The teletransportation problem. Imagine stepping into a teleporter that works like this. It scans your body down to the subatomic level, transmits that information to Mars, and reconstructs you there while destroying the original. The person who emerges on Mars has all your memories, personality traits, and physical characteristics. There's no detectable difference between you before teleportation and the person who arrives on Mars. The Mars person feels a seamless continuity of consciousness, as if they just stepped from one room to another. Would you use this teleporter? Your answer reveals something profound about how you understand personal identity. If you view identity as based on psychological continuity, you might see this as merely an unusual form of travel. The Mars person is you because they continue your psychological life without interruption. From their perspective, the means of transportation shouldn't matter. Whether walking, flying, or teleporting, you're still you when you arrive. But if you believe identity requires physical continuity, you might view teleportation as death, followed by the creation of a duplicate. The original you is destroyed, and while a perfect copy exists, it's not really you, just someone exactly like you who thinks they're you. By this view, teleportation is a suicide machine, coupled with a perfect copying machine. The philosopher Derek Parfit suggests this dilemma reveals something important. The question, would I survive teleportation, might not have a definitive answer. This isn't because we lack information, but because personal identity itself might be conceptually indeterminate. There's no fact of the matter about whether you survive or die, because our concept of personal identity breaks down in such cases. Parfit argues that what matters isn't identity itself, but relation R, psychological connectedness and continuity. The Mars person has maximum R relation to you. So in what matters, teleportation preserves what's important about survival. Whether we call this the same person becomes a merely verbal question without deep significance. This view is counterintuitive. Most of us think there must be a fact about whether we'd survive teleportation. But perhaps this intuition comes from ordinary cases where psychological and physical continuity typically go together. When they diverge, as in teleportation, our concept of identity might not yield clear answers. The teleportation problem becomes even stranger if we consider variations. What if the original isn't destroyed, creating two people with equal claim to being you? What if the teleporter malfunctions, creating an imperfect copy with only some of your memories? What if your information is stored for years before being used to create a new body? These thought experiments reveal that personal identity might be less like a binary fact, either you survive or you don't, and more like a matter of degree, with different aspects of continuity that can come apart in unusual cases. Perhaps the teleportation problem isn't answerable because it exposes contradictions in our intuitive concept of what makes you the same person over time. The body swap problem. Imagine waking up tomorrow in someone else's body, not metaphorically, literally. You open your eyes and find yourself in a completely different body, yet your memories, personality, and consciousness seem intact. Looking in the mirror, a stranger stares back, but from the inside, you still feel like yourself. Meanwhile, someone else, apparently with their consciousness, now inhabits your original body. This body swap scenario raises fundamental questions about personal identity. Are you fundamentally your body, your mind, or some combination? If your mind can transfer to another body while maintaining psychological continuity, what does that tell us about what you essentially are? Our intuitions here can be contradictory. On one hand, if you retain your memories, personality, values, and sense of self after a body swap, it seems you've survived the transfer, suggesting personal identity follows consciousness rather than the body. On the other hand, others might consider the person in your original body to be you, based on physical appearance and continuity. Consider how you'd navigate this situation practically. you'd probably try to convince your loved ones that you're really you, despite your new appearance. You might cite private memories and experiences only you could know. This suggests we believe the real you goes with your psychology, not your physical form. But what exactly transfers in this scenario? It can't be a physical soul if we're approaching this naturalistically. Perhaps it's your pattern of information, the particular way your memories and personality are structured. This suggests a functionalist view where identity consists in the continuation of a particular psychological pattern, regardless of the physical substrate implementing it. The body swap scenario becomes even more complex when we consider questions of embodiment. Would your personality gradually change to align with your new body's capabilities and limitations? How would different hormones, physical abilities, or neurological structures affect your sense of self? Our minds and bodies interact in complex ways, raising questions about whether a complete transfer of you is even coherent. The scenario also raises practical ethical questions. Who would have legal rights to your property? The person with your memories or the person with your body? Who would be responsible for your prior commitments and obligations? Our legal and social systems predominantly track identity through the body, creating potential conflicts with the psychological continuity that many of us intuitively prioritize. Body swaps remain fictional, but related questions arise with real-world identity transformations. People who experience profound changes through trauma, religious conversion, or significant life events sometimes describe feeling like a different person. While less dramatic than a literal body swap, these transformations raise similar questions about what aspects of you must remain consistent for you to remain yourself. The duplication problem. Imagine a machine creates a perfect atom-by-atom duplicate of you. This duplicate has all your memories, personality traits, desires, beliefs, and physical characteristics. The duplicate sincerely believes they are you and has memories of your entire life up to the moment of duplication. Now, there are two beings with equal claim to being the real you. Which one is actually you? The natural response might be, I'm the original. The duplicate is just a copy. But this raises puzzling questions. From the inside, both you and your duplicate would have exactly the same evidence for believing you're the original. Both would have identical memories leading up to the duplication. Neither would feel like a copy. This creates an unsettling asymmetry. You know you're you, but your duplicate is equally certain they're you. Yet you believe you have a special status as the real you that your duplicate lacked, despite having no evidence available to you that wouldn't also be available to them. The philosopher Derek Parfit suggested this reveals something important. Identity might not be what fundamentally matters in survival. What matters isn't whether some future person is the same person as you in some binary, all-or-nothing sense, but rather the degree of psychological continuity and connectedness between you now and future individuals. In the duplication case, both the original and duplicate have maximum psychological continuity with your pre-duplication self. From the perspective of what matters in survival, you might have double survival rather than surviving as one specific person. This contradicts our intuition that identity must be one-to-one, that you can only survive as a single future person. But perhaps this intuition arises from the fact that in normal circumstances, psychological continuity branches in only one direction. When it branches in two, our concept of identity breaks down. The duplication problem becomes even more puzzling if we consider variation. What if the original is destroyed in the copying process, like in teleportation? What if the copying happens gradually, with parts of you replaced one by one? What if the duplicate is created while you're asleep, and you never learn whether you're the original or the copy? These thought experiments suggest personal identity might be less fundamental than we assume. Perhaps the deep truth isn't that you are the same person over time, in some metaphysical sense, but rather that there are relations of psychological continuity between person stages at different times. When these relations branch, as in duplication, questions about which resulting person is really you may have no determinate answer. Not because we lack information, but because our concept of identity itself is inherently limited. The Ship of Theseus. Identity Paradox. We've already explored the Ship of Theseus paradox as it applies to objects, but it becomes even more fascinating when applied directly to human identity. Your body replaces most of its cells every decade or so. Your brain rewires itself based on experience. Your beliefs, values, and personality shift over time. Given all these changes, in what sense are you the same person you were as a child? Unlike the wooden ship, where parts are deliberately replaced, your body's renewal happens naturally and continuously. Skin cells live about a month before being replaced. Red blood cells last around 4 months. Even your fat cells, once thought permanent, are replaced over roughly a decade. Some neurons last a lifetime, but their internal components are constantly recycled. Physically speaking, you're like a river, maintaining a consistent form while the actual matter flows through and changes. Beyond the physical, your psychological makeup transforms too. The 5-year-old you once were had different memories, beliefs, preferences, personality traits, and cognitive abilities than you do now. If your adult self met your childhood self, you might not even like each other. Yet most of us strongly believe we've remained the same person throughout. This creates a paradox. How can you be the same when almost everything about you has changed? If you replace all the parts of a ship one by one, the resulting vessel seems like a different ship. But if we apply the same logic to ourselves, it would mean you become a different person as your cells replace themselves, a conclusion most of us reject. Some philosophers emphasize psychological continuity. You remain the same person because each day you change only slightly, creating an unbroken chain of overlapping memories and psychological connections. Others focus on narrative identity. You're the protagonist of an ongoing life story, with early chapters causally connected to later ones, despite changes in character development. The Buddhist tradition takes a different approach, suggesting that this paradox reveals a profound truth. The stable, unchanging self is an illusion. What we call self is actually a process of constant change, with no fixed essence beneath the flow. This view doesn't deny your existence, but reframes identity as a convenient fiction rather than a metaphysical reality. The ship paradox raises practical questions too. If you committed a crime decades ago, should the significantly changed person you are now be held responsible? Are you morally obligated to fulfill promises made by your younger self, who in many ways was a different person? How can society balance accountability against the reality of personal transformation? Perhaps the answer isn't to resolve the paradox, but to recognize that our concept of personal identity contains inherent tension between change and continuity, between physical and psychological criteria, between objective facts and subjective experience. Your identity may be more like a useful convention than a clear-cut metaphysical truth. The persistence question. What does it take for you to persist through time? This seemingly simple question, philosophers call it the persistence question, reveals profound puzzles about personal identity. Specifically, what conditions must be satisfied for a person at one time to be the same person at another time, despite the many changes that occur between those moments. Imagine yourself at age 5 playing in a sandbox. Now imagine yourself at your current age. What makes these two beings, separated by years with different bodies, different memories, different beliefs and desires, the same person? The 5-year-old doesn't remember much of what you remember, doesn't share many of your current characteristics, and appears physically different. Yet intuitively, most of us believe that child was us. Different philosophical traditions offer competing answers to the persistence question. The psychological continuity view, championed by philosophers like John Locke and Derek Parfit, argues that you persist through time because of overlapping chains of psychological connection, especially memories, but also beliefs, desires, personality traits, and projects. The 5-year-old gradually became you through incremental psychological changes, each new state building on the previous one. The biological continuity view, advocated by thinkers like Eric Olson, argues that you persist because of continued biological functioning of the same organism. The 5-year-old's body grew into yours through biological processes, maintaining the same life despite changes in size, shape, and cellular composition. The narrative view suggests that what makes you the same person is being the protagonist of a coherent life story. The 5-year-old is you because they're the beginning of the biographical narrative that continues to your current chapter. Each approach faces challenges. Psychological continuity theories struggle with cases like severe amnesia or radical personality changes. Biological continuity theories face problems with thought experiments involving brain transplants or uploaded consciousness. Narrative approaches raise questions about who constructs the narrative and whether coherence is imposed rather than discovered. The persistence question becomes even more puzzling when we consider extreme cases. If you suffer total amnesia, but your body continues, are you the same person? If your brain is transferred to a new body, does your identity go with it? If your consciousness were perfectly copied to a computer while your body was destroyed, would you persist as the digital version? Some philosophers argue these puzzles arise because personal identity isn't as fundamental as we assume. Perhaps there's no deep fact about whether someone is the same person in borderline cases. Instead, survival might be a matter of degree. You can be more or less connected to a future person rather than either completely persisting or completely ceasing to exist. The persistence question ultimately pushes us to reconsider our assumptions about what we fundamentally are. Are we essentially psychological beings, biological organisms, narratives, or something else entirely? The answer shapes not just how we understand identity through time, but how we approach practical questions about responsibility, anticipation, compensation, and ethical treatment of future versions of ourselves and others. The problem of fading qualia. Imagine scientists offering to gradually replace your biological brain neurons with functionally identical artificial ones. They promise a perfect substitution. Each artificial neuron will perform exactly the same information processing as its biological counterpart. The replacement happens incrementally, one neuron at a time, while you remain conscious throughout the process. At first, with just a few neurons replaced, you notice no difference. But what happens when 10% of your brain is artificial? 50%? 99%? Eventually, you'd have a completely synthetic brain that processes information identically to your original. Would your conscious experience, your subjective feelings, sensory experiences, and inner life remain the same throughout? Or would it gradually fade away as your brain becomes more artificial? This is the problem of fading qualia, a thought experiment proposed by philosopher David Chalmers that probes the relationship between physical brain function and subjective experience. It forces us to confront puzzling questions about personal identity and consciousness. If functional organization is what matters for consciousness, then your experience shouldn't change at all during the process. After all, the artificial brain performs exactly the same functions as the original. But this seems counterintuitive to many. Something about the biological nature of neurons might seem essential to generating the felt quality of experience. But if consciousness does fade during the replacement, it creates strange implications. Imagine the process at 99% completion. You'd have only 1% of your original neurons yet would still be walking, talking, and insisting you feel conscious, because the functional organization producing that behavior remains intact. You might report, "My consciousness feels only slightly diminished," while actually experiencing almost nothing, a kind of partial philosophical zombie. This situation seems bizarre. A person whose inner experience has almost vanished yet who behaves exactly as if fully conscious, even engaging in philosophical discussions about their own consciousness. It suggests a radical disconnection between behavior and inner experience that many find implausible. The fading qualia problem reveals tensions in our understanding of identity across physical changes. If you maintain behavioral continuity but lose subjective experience, have you survived the transformation? Is the being with the fully artificial brain still you, even if that being lacks consciousness? Or is conscious experience essential to your identity, making the replacement process a form of death despite behavioral continuity? Some philosophers argue that this thought experiment actually demonstrates the implausibility of consciousness fading during functional preservation. Others suggest it reveals fundamental limitations in our ability to understand the relationship between physical brain states and subjective experience. The problem of fading qualia doesn't just apply to science fiction scenarios. It connects to real questions about artificial intelligence, potential future brain enhancements, and how we understand the relationship between our physical embodiment and our identity as conscious beings. As neuroscience and AI advance, thought experiments like this move closer to practical ethical questions about the nature and value of consciousness. The unity of consciousness paradox. Right now, you're having a unified conscious experience. You simultaneously see these words, feel the position of your body, hear background sounds, and maintain a sense of yourself as the subject of all these experiences. This unity seems fundamental to who you are. You don't experience some sensations as belonging to one subject and others to another. But this apparent unity of consciousness creates profound paradoxes for personal identity. The first paradox emerges from split brain cases. When the corpus callosum connecting the brain's hemispheres is severed, a procedure once used to treat epilepsy, patients can develop what appears to be two separate streams of consciousness. The left hemisphere might not know what the right hemisphere is experiencing, yet both seem conscious. Has one person become two? If consciousness can split this way, what does it mean for the unity we typically experience? An even more puzzling scenario is the possibility of consciousness merging. Imagine technology allowing two people's brain hemispheres to communicate as seamlessly as your own hemispheres do now. Would this create a single unified consciousness encompassing what were previously two separate people? If so, what happens to the original identities? These possibilities challenge our assumption that consciousness naturally aligns with individual bodies and persists as a unified field. Perhaps the apparent unity is contingent rather than necessary, a product of particular neural arrangements that could be altered. The unity paradox extends to how we understand ourselves across time. While your consciousness feels unified at each moment, it's fragmented across time by sleep and other interruptions. When you wake up, how does your consciousness know to unify with yesterday's experiences rather than someone else's? What creates the boundary of your unified experience both momentarily and across time? Some philosophers, like Derek Parfit, suggest the unity of consciousness might be more like a political union than a metaphysical fact. Just as the United Kingdom is unified in some ways, but contains distinct entities, perhaps consciousness unifies distinct processes without requiring some deeper metaphysical unity. Others, like Immanuel Kant, argue that unity is fundamental to consciousness itself, not something added to separate experiences, but the precondition for having experiences at all. By this view, wherever there is consciousness, there must be unity. The unity paradox connects to practical questions about identity in unusual cases. If someone develops dissociative identity disorder with apparently separate streams of consciousness, how should we understand their identity? If future technology allows consciousness to be split, merged, or distributed across multiple platforms, how would we track identity and responsibility? These questions suggest our intuitive concept of personal identity may be too closely tied to the contingent unity of consciousness we typically experience. If consciousness can split or merge, perhaps identity should be understood as something that can similarly divide or combine, rather than necessarily remaining unified and distinct. The puzzle of transplanted memories. Imagine scientists could extract someone else's memories and implant them in your brain, perfectly integrating them with your existing memories. After the procedure, you'd have vivid first-person recollections of experiences that actually happened to someone else Yet subjectively, they'd feel indistinguishable from your authentic memories. You might remember growing up in a town you've never visited, attending a school you never went to, and having childhood friends you've never actually met. This thought experiment, the puzzle of transplanted memories, raises profound questions about personal identity. If memory is crucial to who you are, what happens when your memories include events from someone else's life? Have you become partially that other person? Has your identity been compromised or expanded? The philosopher John Locke famously tied personal identity to psychological continuity, especially memory. You are the same person as some past individual if you can remember being that person. But transplanted memories complicate this view. They create a mismatch between psychological continuity, which now extends to someone else's past, and bodily continuity, which remains solely your own. Consider how this affects your sense of self. Would you feel partially like the memory donor? Would you feel responsible for actions in those implanted memories if they included skills the other person had developed, playing piano or speaking Chinese? Would you acquire those abilities along with the memories? The puzzle becomes even more complex with variations. What if all your memories were replaced with someone else's? Would you become that person in a meaningful sense despite maintaining your original body? What if your memories were copied to multiple recipients? Would each have some claim to your identity? This thought experiment connects to real phenomena like false memory, where people sincerely remember events that never happened. It also relates to memory disorders like amnesia, which can profoundly affect identity. If losing memories can change who you are, what about gaining someone else's? Some philosophers distinguish between merely knowing about past events and genuinely remembering them from the inside. Perhaps transplanted memories would feel different from authentic ones in subtle ways, lacking the right kind of causal connection to your past. Others suggest that what matters for identity isn't just having memories, but having the right kind of memories, those causally connected to your own past experiences. The transplanted memory puzzle reveals tensions in our concept of personal identity. If we emphasize psychological continuity, transplanted memories should change who you are. If we emphasize bodily continuity, they shouldn't. The fact that different criteria pull in opposite directions suggests personal identity might be less unified and more complex than we typically assume. This puzzle raises practical questions too. If memory transfer ever became possible, what rights and responsibilities would transfer with memories? Would memory donors maintain ownership of their memories even after sharing them? These questions highlight how deeply intertwined our concepts of memory, identity, and selfhood really are. The problem of quantum immortality. Imagine the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is correct, meaning the universe constantly branches into parallel realities based on quantum events. Now imagine you're in a terrible situation, say, a quantum suicide machine that has a 50% chance of killing you instantly each time it's activated. You press the button. In half the resulting universes, you die immediately. But in the other half, you survive. From an objective third-person perspective, your chances of survival are 50%. But here's where things get strange. If consciousness requires a living brain, you can only subjectively experience the branches where you survive. You cannot experience the branches where you die. If you press the button 10 times, objectively the chance of surviving all 10 trials is minuscule, 1/1024. But subjectively, you will only ever find yourself in that rare branch where you miraculously survived every time. This is the problem of quantum immortality, a thought experiment that generates a disturbing paradox about personal identity. It suggests that from a first-person perspective, you might be subjectively immortal, always finding yourself against all odds in branches where you survive, even as your existence becomes vanishingly unlikely from an objective standpoint. The paradox deepens when we consider aging. Even if quantum branching always includes some universe where you survive any particular threat, your body still ages. Would you eventually find yourself as an impossibly old person, surviving one improbable medical miracle after another? Or does consciousness require a minimally functional brain, meaning your subjective experience must eventually end. Some philosophers argue that quantum immortality confuses different levels of description. Just because there's a branch where you survive doesn't mean your consciousness continues uninterrupted across branches. Perhaps consciousness doesn't transfer between branches any more than it transfers between different people in the same universe. Others suggest that if the many worlds interpretation is correct, we should reconsider what identity across time means. Perhaps you are not a single continuous entity, but a branching tree of related moments of consciousness, most branches of which terminate while others continue. Max Tegmark, a physicist who has explored this idea, points out that subjective immortality wouldn't be pleasant. The most likely branches where you survive extreme events often involve severe injury or brain damage. You might subjectively find yourself surviving, but with dramatically decreased quality of life. The quantum immortality problem raises profound questions about the relationship between consciousness, identity, and physical reality. If consciousness is tied to physical brain states, yet subjective experience can only follow paths where those brain states continue to exist, we face puzzling questions about the nature of first-person experience in a branching universe. While highly speculative, this paradox forces us to consider whether personal identity makes sense in a quantum multiverse. Perhaps our intuitions about continuing as the same person over time assume a single continuous reality that quantum physics suggests might not exist. In a branching universe, identity itself might need to be understood as fundamentally branching rather than linear. The Boltzmann brain problem. Imagine a universe existing for an almost infinite time, with random quantum fluctuations occasionally creating highly ordered systems before they dissolve back into randomness. Given enough time, these fluctuations could theoretically produce a fully functioning human brain with all your memories and consciousness floating in empty space. This Boltzmann brain would exist only momentarily before disintegrating. Yet during its brief existence, it would have all your memories, thoughts, and the impression of a normal life. This bizarre scenario creates a troubling identity paradox. How do you know you're not a Boltzmann brain right now? Perhaps you aren't a human with a real past, but a random fluctuation with false memories of a life that never happened. Perhaps the world around you doesn't exist beyond your immediate perception. Perhaps this moment is all there is, a brief random arrangement of particles creating the illusion of a coherent history and future. Scientists and philosophers take this problem seriously because of an unsettling probability calculation. In an eternal universe governed by known physics, Boltzmann brains might vastly outnumber normal brains like ours. If so, purely statistically, you're more likely to be a hallucinating Boltzmann brain than a normal human. This creates a skeptical nightmare worse than Descartes' evil demon. At least Descartes' demon creates a consistent, ongoing reality. The Boltzmann brain scenario suggests even your sense of existing in time might be illusory. You might be a momentary fluctuation with memories of a past that never occurred and expectations of a future that will never happen. The paradox challenges our most basic assumptions about identity across time. If your apparent memories might be random fluctuations rather than records of actual experiences, what grounds do you have for believing you're the same person who existed yesterday? If continuity of memory and consciousness is fundamental to personal identity, but that continuity might be illusory, how can you be confident in your identity at all? Cosmologists have tried to resolve this by arguing that our universe isn't eternal, or that quantum fluctuations don't work this way. Others suggest that even if Boltzmann brains are possible, they're not actually more numerous than normal brains. Philosophers note that the problem resembles ancient skeptical arguments. We can't conclusively prove we're not in such a scenario. However, The fact that our experiences remain consistent and predictable provides practical grounds for treating our apparent reality as genuine. The Boltzmann brain problem connects to deeper questions about consciousness and reality. If consciousness emerges from physical processes, and those processes could theoretically occur through random fluctuation, what does this tell us about the relationship between mind and matter? If your entire subjective world could exist as a momentary fluctuation, what does this suggest about the nature of experience itself? While highly speculative, this thought experiment serves as a humbling reminder of how tenuous our understanding of consciousness, identity, and reality might be. The seemingly solid world of experience, memory, and personal continuity could, in principle, be more fragile and contingent than we typically assume. The problem of future shock identity. Imagine someone from the 1800s transported to our time. They'd encounter technologies, social structures, and cultural norms beyond their comprehension. Their conceptual frameworks and identity, shaped by their era, might prove inadequate for making sense of the modern world. This is a mild version of what futurists call future shock, the psychological distress caused by rapid change outpacing our ability to adapt. Now imagine yourself transported not just decades, but centuries into the future. You'd likely encounter technologies that fundamentally transform what it means to be human. Perhaps mind uploading, consciousness merging, extreme life extension, or artificial general intelligence. These technologies wouldn't just change society, they'd challenge the very foundations of personal identity. This creates what we might call the problem of future shock identity. If technological change can transform the conditions of selfhood, what happens to personal identity in scenarios where the very concept of person has been radically reimagined? Consider mind uploading. If your consciousness could be transferred to a digital substrate, would the uploaded version be you? What if multiple copies were created? What if the original biological you continued to exist alongside the digital version? Our current concepts of identity assume one person occupies one body at one time, assumptions that such technology would violate, or consider radical life extension. If you lived for 500 years, would the you of year 500 be meaningfully the same person as the you of year 50? Normal human lifespans allow for significant change while maintaining identity. But at what point does accumulated transformation render the concept of continuous identity meaningless? Most troubling might be technologies allowing consciousness to merge. If your mind could blend with another's, creating a new unified consciousness with memories and traits from both sources, what happens to the original identity? Our concept of personal identity assumes boundaries between selves that such technology would dissolve. The problem intensifies when we consider compounding effects. Humans adapted to stone tools over millennia, to printing presses over centuries, to smartphones over decades. But what happens when potentially identity-altering technologies arrive not centuries apart, but simultaneously or in rapid succession? The conceptual frameworks we use to understand ourselves might not evolve quickly enough to maintain coherence. Some philosophers suggest we're already experiencing early versions of this problem. Social media, smartphones, and AI assistants are changing how we construct and understand our identities. We increasingly exist across multiple platforms, manage various online personas, and rely on external devices as extensions of our mind. These developments stretch, but don't yet break our concepts of selfhood. The problem of future shock identity isn't just speculative philosophy. It has practical implications for how we approach developing technologies that might fundamentally alter the human condition. It raises questions about ethical frameworks that assume stable personal identity over time, legal systems premised on one person, one body continuity, and social structures built around recognizable patterns of human life and development. Perhaps future humans will develop new conceptual frameworks that accommodate forms of identity we can barely imagine. Fluid, distributed, mergeable identities that make our current understanding seem as limited as ancient concepts seem to us. Or perhaps certain aspects of identity will prove resistant to technological change, revealing something fundamental about consciousness and selfhood that persists even as other aspects transform radically. The problem of time travel identity. Imagine meeting your younger self through time travel. There you both are, the same person at different ages, simultaneously existing and conversing. This scenario creates what we might call the problem of time travel identity. How can one person exist twice at the same moment without violating the logic of identity? The standard concept of numerical identity, that one thing cannot be two different things, seems challenged by this scenario. You and your younger self are clearly not identical in all property. You have different memories, perhaps different beliefs and desires, maybe different physical characteristics. Yet intuitively, you're the same person across time. Time travel forces this temporal difference into a spatial one, creating a paradox. The philosopher David Lewis proposed a solution involving personal time versus external time. In your personal timeline, you're first young, then you time travel, then you're older, meeting your younger self. Your younger self hasn't yet time traveled. You're the same person at different stages of personal time, even though you coexist in external time. But this raises further puzzles. If your younger self, upon meeting you, decides never to time travel, this creates a contradiction. You couldn't exist as the time traveler if your younger self never becomes you. This connects to the grandfather paradox, but with identity specifically at stake. How can you remain you if your younger self makes decisions that prevent you from becoming who you are? The paradox intensifies if we consider interacting with your younger self in ways that change their development. If you teach your younger self different skills than you learned, or help them avoid formative traumas you experienced, they might develop into someone significantly different from you. At what point would these changes make them no longer your past self, but someone else entirely? Some philosophers suggest time travel requires parallel timelines or branching realities to avoid these contradictions. Your younger self isn't literally your past self, but a counterpart in another branch of reality. This preserves identity logic, but raises questions about what makes someone you across different timelines. The problem extends to memory and psychological continuity. After meeting your future self, your younger self would have memories your older self lacked, the memory of meeting your future self. This creates an asymmetry in psychological continuity that challenges Lockean accounts of personal identity based on memory connection. Time travel identity paradoxes reveal tensions in our ordinary concept of identity across time. We typically assume that personal identity involves being the same entity at different times, with those different temporal stages existing sequentially, not simultaneously. Time travel forces us to consider whether being the same person makes conceptual sense when sequential becomes simultaneous. While time travel remains theoretical, these puzzles illuminate how deeply temporal assumptions are built into our concept of personal identity. They suggest that what it means to be the same person might be more complex and possibly more contradictory than our everyday understanding acknowledges. Identity across time might require rethinking. If the normal sequential relationship between earlier and later selves could be disrupted or reversed through technological intervention. The digital backup problem. Imagine technology exists to create perfect digital backups of your brain, complete records of all your neural connections, memories, personality traits, and consciousness patterns. These backups could be activated if something happened to you, creating a version of you with all your memories up to the moment of the last backup. Many people would create these backups as insurance against death. Now imagine you're in a terrible accident. Your body and brain are destroyed, but your latest backup from yesterday is activated. A new physical body is created, perhaps biological, perhaps robotic, with your backed up mind. This new being wakes up with all your memories up to yesterday. believing they are you. This creates what we might call the digital backup problem. Is this activated backup actually you? Did you survive death through your backup, or did you die while something else, a copy or simulation, continues thinking it's you? From the backup's perspective, there's perfect psychological continuity. They remember your life up to the backup point, then seemingly wake up in a new body. They feel like you, with your memories, personality, and sense of self intact, except for the lost day. They'll likely insist they are you and be relieved the backup system worked. But from your perspective before the accident, the situation might seem very different. Would you face death comforted by knowing a backup exists, or would you consider your backup a separate entity who merely thinks they're you? Would backing yourself up feel like creating a path to survival, or merely ensuring that a copy of you exists after your death? The paradox deepens with variations. What if your backup were activated while you still lived, creating two simultaneous versions of you? What if multiple backups were activated, creating many beings with equal claim to being you? What if backups were created at different life stages, resulting in versions of you from different ages all existing simultaneously? This problem reveals tensions in our concepts of identity and survival. If psychological continuity is what matters for personal identity, the backup seems to be you continued. If bodily continuity matters, the backup seems to be a different entity. Our intuitions pull in conflicting directions. Some philosophers, like Derek Parfit, suggest this reveals that identity itself might not be what fundamentally matters in survival. Perhaps what's important isn't whether the backup is really you in some binary sense, but rather the degree of psychological connectedness and continuity between you and the backup. By this view, the backup maintains what matters in survival, even if it's not strictly identical to you. The digital backup problem has practical implications as brain scanning and computer technology advance. How should we think about potential future technologies for mind uploading or consciousness transfer? What rights would activated backups have? Who would own the property, maintain the relationships, or be responsible for the obligations of the original person? While currently theoretical, this paradox forces us to examine our concepts of identity and survival, revealing potential incoherences in how we understand personhood across technological interventions that might one day bridge the gap between life and death. The personal identity amnesia problem. Imagine waking up in a hospital bed with complete amnesia. You have no memories of your past, no recognition of your name, no knowledge of your relationships or career. Your personality, preferences, and skills remain intact, but your autobiographical memory is entirely gone. The doctors tell you that you're John Smith, showing you identification and photographs of your life. But subjectively, none of this feels like your history. It feels like information about a stranger. This creates what we might call the personal identity amnesia problem. Are you still John Smith? If personal identity depends heavily on psychological continuity, especially memories connecting your past to your present, severe amnesia seems to break this continuity. Yet intuitively, most people would say you remain the same person despite memory loss. The paradox reveals tensions in our concept of identity. On one hand, memory seems crucial to who we are. Your sense of being you depends significantly on remembering your past. On the other hand, we typically consider amnesia patients to be the same person with a medical condition, not a new person who replaced the original. Consider how this affects your first-person perspective. From inside the experience, you might feel like a completely new person who has inherited John Smith's body, legal identity, and social relationships. You might feel no connection to John's past actions, commitments, or relationships. Are you morally responsible for promises John made? Are you still married to John's spouse? Should you continue John's career? The philosopher Maria Schechtman distinguishes between forensic identity, tracking who is responsible for past actions, and empathic identity, the psychological sense of identifying with a past self. Amnesia severs empathic identity, while forensic identity remains intact through bodily continuity. This explains why we hold amnesia patients legally responsible for past action, while acknowledging their subjective disconnect from those actions. The amnesia problem complicates theories of identity based primarily on psychological continuity. John Locke famously tied personal identity to memory. You are the same person as some past individual if you can remember being that person. By this criterion, severe amnesia seems to create a new person. Yet this conflicts with our intuition that bodily continuity maintains identity despite memory loss. Some philosophers suggest that what matters is the capacity for memory, not actual memories. The amnesia patient has lost specific memories, but retains the cognitive architecture that created those memories. Perhaps this preserved capacity maintains identity even when particular memories are lost. Others emphasize narrative identity. You are the protagonist of your life story. Amnesia creates a narrative break, but the story continues with the same protagonist, even if that protagonist can't recall earlier chapters. The amnesia problem reveals how our concept of personal identity involves multiple criteria that can come apart in unusual cases. When psychological and bodily continuity diverge, our intuitions about identity become conflicted and uncertain. Perhaps there's no single right answer to whether the amnesia patient remains John Smith. Different aspects of identity point in different directions, revealing personal identity as a cluster concept rather than a unified all-or-nothing property. The transhumanism identity problem. Imagine technology advances to the point where humans can radically enhance themselves. Some people add new senses, perceiving ultraviolet light or magnetic fields. Others increase their intelligence tenfold through brain-computer interface. Some replace most of their biology with mechanical parts, while others merge their minds with artificial intelligence. Eventually, these enhanced beings might differ from baseline humans more than humans differ from chimpanzees. This creates what we might call the transhumanism identity problem. At what point do such radical enhancements transform someone into a different kind of being, rather than merely an enhanced version of the same person? When does quantitative enhancement create qualitative transformation? Consider someone who gradually enhances their brain, doubling their intelligence, then quadrupling it, then increasing it 100-fold. Each step might preserve psychological continuity with the previous stage, but the final super-intelligent being might have a radically different way of experiencing and understanding reality. Would this superintelligence still be the same person who began the enhancement process, just smarter? Or would the transformation in cognitive capacity create a fundamentally different identity? The paradox intensifies when we consider adding entirely new mental capacities. If you gain the ability to directly perceive quantum phenomena or process information in ways no unenhanced human can comprehend, your subjective experience might become literally unimaginable to your former self. Just as a person born blind who gains sight enters a world they couldn't previously conceive, radical cognitive enhancements might create subjective realities entirely discontinuous with your current experience. Some philosophers argue that personal identity requires maintaining a recognizable psychological essence, core values, personality traits, and self-concept that remain stable despite other changes. By this view, enhancements that preserve this core would maintain identity, while those that transform it would create a new being. Others suggest identity depends on psychological continuity rather than similarity. Even if the final enhanced being shares few mental characteristics with the original person, as long as the transformation happened gradually, with each stage connecting to the next, identity would be preserved. This resembles how we maintain identity from childhood to adulthood, despite profound psychological changes. The transhumanism identity problem has practical implications as enhancement technologies develop. Who would have legal rights to property acquired by the original person? Would marriage vows still apply after one partner undergoes radical enhancement? Would enhanced beings deserve the same rights as baseline humans, or different rights reflecting their different capacities? The paradox reveals tensions in how we understand personal identity across profound transformation. Most identity theories were developed to explain ordinary human development, not radical enhancement. When technology enables changes that push beyond the boundaries these theories were designed to accommodate, we may need new conceptual framework. Perhaps enhancement will eventually reveal personal identity to be more like a spectrum than a binary property. Rather than asking whether the enhanced being is the same person, we might ask about degrees of continuity across different dimensions: psychological, physical, social, and moral. Identity might persist in some respects while transforming in others, creating partial rather than complete continuity between the original person and their enhanced successor. The problem of parallel lives. Imagine encountering someone who appears to be you from a parallel universe. They share your exact genetic makeup, were born to the same parents on the same day, and had identical experiences through childhood. But at some point, your lives diverged. Perhaps they made a crucial choice differently, or experienced an accident you narrowly avoided. Now, they've arrived in your universe, creating what we might call the problem of parallel lives. How should you understand your relationship to this alternate version of yourself? This scenario, while science fictional, raises profound questions about identity. Your parallel self isn't you in the strict philosophical sense of numerical identity. You're clearly two distinct beings existing simultaneously, yet they seem more intimately connected to you than any other person could be. They share your formative experiences, many of your memories, perhaps your core personality traits and values. From a psychological perspective, they might understand you better than anyone else possibly could. They know exactly what it felt like to be you during your shared history. They might anticipate your thoughts and reactions with uncanny accuracy. Yet despite this deep similarity, your divergent experiences have made you different people, perhaps dramatically so, if the divergence happened long ago or involved significant events. The paradox reveals something important about identity. Similarity, even extreme similarity, is not the same as identity. Your parallel self might be functionally identical to you in many respects, yet remains a distinct person with their own separate consciousness and ongoing experiences. They are both you and not you in different respects. The closest possible case of what philosophers might call qualitative identity, extreme similarity, without numerical identity, being literally the same entity. This distinction becomes practically important when considering questions of responsibility and relationship. Are you responsible for actions your parallel self took during your shared history? Should you feel guilty about their misdeeds or proud of their accomplishment? Would a romantic relationship with them constitute some form of narcissism or selfishness? Would their death affect you more profoundly than the death of others, perhaps feeling partly like your own death? The problem intensifies if we consider multiple parallel selves simultaneously. If 10 versions of you from different universes suddenly appeared, each with slightly different histories, would some deserve more recognition as really you than others? Would those whose lives diverged more recently have stronger claims to shared identity with you than those whose lives diverged earlier? This thought experiment connects to philosophical questions about what Robert Nozick called closest continuers. If multiple future beings have claims to being your successor, which has the strongest claim? The parallel lives scenario forces this question into the present rather than the future, asking which simultaneously existing being has the strongest connection to your identity. While parallel universes remain theoretical, this problem illuminates something important about identity in ordinary life. Each of us might have become many different people based on choices made or circumstances experienced. Your parallel self represents a road not taken, a version of you that might have been. Recognizing both the deep connection and the ultimate distinctness of this counterfactual self reminds us that identity involves not just who we are, but who we might have been under different circumstances. The Sleeping Beauty problem for identity. Imagine participating in an experiment. On Sunday, researchers put you to sleep. They flip a fair coin. If it comes up heads, they wake you once on Monday. If it comes up tails, they wake you on Monday. Erase your memory of that awakening and wake you again on Tuesday. In both cases, when you wake up, you've undergone memory erasure and don't know what day it is or whether you've been awakened before. This classic probability puzzle, the Sleeping Beauty problem, creates a fascinating identity paradox. If the coin lands tails and you're awakened twice, how should we understand the relationship between Monday you and Tuesday you? Are they the same person despite the memory discontinuity? From an outside perspective, Monday you and Tuesday you are stages of the same person, same body, same brain, same history up to the experiment. But from the inside, the experience is different. Tuesday, you has no memory of Monday's awakening. The memory erasure creates a psychological discontinuity that challenges theories of identity based on psychological connectedness. The paradox intensifies when we consider what happens if researchers ask upon each awakening. What probability do you assign to the coin having landed heads? This creates a strange situation where your answer might depend on whether you consider yourself the same person across awakening. If you view Monday you and Tuesday you as the same person experiencing multiple awakenings, you might reason, I'm equally likely to be experiencing any of my awakenings. There's one possible awakening if heads, two if tails, so the probability of heads is 1/3. But if you view them as distinct person stages, connected by bodily continuity, but divided by memory erasure, you might think the coin was fair, so the probability remains 1/2. This reveals something profound about self-location and identity. When memory continuity breaks down, different assumptions about what constitutes the same person lead to different rational beliefs about your situation. The paradox connects to real questions about identity through unconsciousness and memory loss. When you wake from dreamless sleep, what makes you the same person who went to bed? When someone with amnesia cannot remember their past, what makes them the same person? The Sleeping Beauty scenario isolates these questions by creating controlled memory discontinuity. Some philosophers, like Derek Parfit, suggest cases like this reveal that personal identity might not be what fundamentally matters. Perhaps what's important isn't whether Monday you and Tuesday you are the same person in some binary sense, but rather the particular relationships that connect these different temporal stages, relationships of bodily continuity, causal dependence, and partial psychological connectedness despite the memory gap. The Sleeping Beauty problem for identity reminds us that our intuitive concept of being the same person across time relies heavily on memory continuity. When this continuity is deliberately broken, we face puzzling questions about how to locate ourselves in time and possibility space, questions that may not have definitive answers because they expose tensions within our concept of personal identity itself. The embodied cognition identity problem. Your mind isn't just in your brain, it's shaped by your entire body. This is the core insight of embodied cognition, a framework suggesting that cognition depends fundamentally on features of our physical bodies. We think with and through our bodies, not just our brain. But this creates what we might call the embodied cognition identity problem. If your mind is partly constituted by your bodily experience, what happens to your identity if your body changes dramatically? Consider radical body transformation. If your consciousness were transferred to a very different body, perhaps much larger or smaller, a different gender, a different species, or a robotic form, how would this change your mind and identity? Embodied cognition suggests the change would be profound, potentially reshaping your cognitive processes, emotional responses, and sense of self. A person who has always been tall experiences the world differently from someone who has always been short. Their spatial perceptions, social interactions, and self-concept develop around their bodily reality. Similarly, different sensory capabilities create different cognitive worlds. A person with acute hearing processes and understands their environment differently than someone with exceptional vision or touch sensitivity. This creates a paradox for body-switching thought experiments. If psychological continuity is what matters for personal identity, it seems you should remain the same person after moving to a new body. But if embodied cognition is correct, your psychology itself would transform as it adapts to new bodily experiences, potentially changing you so fundamentally that questions arise about whether identity truly persists. The philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty argued that our bodily habits and skills constitute much of who we are. The trained dancer, skilled carpenter, or experienced rock climber doesn't just have knowledge about movement. Their expertise exists as embodied know-how that shapes their perception and interaction with the world. If these bodily capabilities change suddenly, their mode of being in the world would transform. Research on phantom limbs and prosthetics offers real-world insights into this question. People with prosthetic limbs often experience the prosthesis becoming incorporated into their body schema, their brain's internal model of their body. Similarly, tools we use regularly can become extensions of our embodied cognition, as when a blind person's cane becomes an extension of their sensory apparatus rather than just an external tool. These examples suggest our embodied identity has plasticity. It can incorporate new elements and adapt to bodily changes. But this adaptability has limits. Some bodily changes might be so radical that they would fundamentally transform rather than merely modify your embodied cognition, raising questions about identity persistence. The embodied cognition identity problem reminds us that who we are isn't just about abstract psychological properties like memories and beliefs. It's also about how we physically exist in and engage with the world. Our bodies aren't just vessels containing our minds. They're constitutive elements of our cognitive systems, and thus our identities. This suggests that scenarios involving radical bodily transformation might cause more profound identity disruption than many philosophical thought experiments assume, as changes to embodiment would reshape the very cognitive processes that constitute who you are as a thinking, feeling being. The testimony problem. Imagine someone claiming to be you from the future with detailed knowledge of your private thoughts, memories, and experiences. They know things only you could know, childhood memories you've never shared, secret hopes and fears, even thoughts you had this morning. They insist they are you, having traveled back in time. Should you believe them? How would you determine if they're telling the truth about their identity? This creates what we might call the testimony problem. How can personal identity be verified through testimony alone? The challenge reveals something important about identity. We typically rely on bodily continuity to track identity. This person is John because he has the same body as yesterday's John. But in unusual cases where this criterion doesn't apply, verification becomes surprisingly difficult. Even the time traveler's perfect knowledge of your memories and psychology doesn't definitively prove identity. Perhaps they're a mind reader or have accessed your memories through technology. Perhaps they're a simulation created with your memories but not actually you. Their testimony alone, no matter how detailed, cannot conclusively establish identity. This problem extends beyond science fiction. Consider verifying identity across radical transformation. If someone claims to have undergone a complete physical transformation while maintaining psychological continuity, perhaps through consciousness transfer to a new body, how could they prove they're the same person? Their testimony about memories might be impressive, but remains insufficient proof. The testimony problem reveals something important. Personal identity seems to involve more than just psychological continuity. If psychological continuity alone determined identity, detailed psychological information should be sufficient for verification. The fact that we find such verification problematic suggests we implicitly recognize other aspects of identity beyond psychology. This connects to broader verification problems in identity. How do you know the person who went to sleep in your bedroom last night is the same person who woke up there this morning? Ordinarily, we rely on bodily continuity as evidence, but this assumes the very continuity we're trying to verify. We accept this circular reasoning in everyday cases because alternatives seem implausible, but in unusual scenarios, the circularity becomes problematic. The testimony problem also raises questions about identity verification in digital environments. Online, we typically verify identity through knowledge, passwords, security questions, biographical details. But this approach assumes that only the authentic person could possess this knowledge, an assumption increasingly challenged by data breaches and identity theft. Some philosophers suggest the testimony problem reveals that personal identity might be fundamentally unverifiable in certain cases, not because of practical limitations, but because our concept of identity contains tensions that become apparent in unusual scenarios. Perhaps there's simply no fact of the matter about whether the time traveler is really you, because our concept of identity isn't equipped to handle cases where psychological continuity exists without the usual physical and causal connection. The testimony problem reminds us that while identity seems intuitively obvious in ordinary cases, our mechanisms for establishing and verifying identity rely on assumptions that become questionable in extraordinary circumstances. This suggests personal identity might be less metaphysically robust and more pragmatically constructed than we typically assume. The childhood discontinuity problem. Think about yourself at age 3. That child shared your name and existed in your body, but how much psychological continuity exists between you now and that toddler? They had different cognitive abilities, different memories, different personality traits, different beliefs and desires. If personal identity requires psychological continuity, as many philosophers suggest, are you really the same person as that child? This creates what we might call the childhood discontinuity problem. Despite the intuitive belief that you've been the same person your entire life, the psychological differences between your adult and early childhood selves are so profound that they challenge theories of identity based primarily on psychological continuity. Consider memory connectedness. You likely have few, if any, direct memories from before age 3 or 4. While you may know things about your early childhood from photographs or stories, these aren't genuine first-person memories. This creates a memory gap between your current self and your earliest years. The discontinuity extends beyond memory. Your cognitive capacities have transformed dramatically. A 3-year-old lacks abstract reasoning, has limited language, and cannot engage in the kind of self-reflection you're capable of now. Your personality, values, and beliefs have likely changed substantially. If these psychological features ground identity, the differences seem significant enough to question continuity. This problem intensifies if we consider prenatal and infant stages. The psychological differences between you now and you as a newborn or fetus are even more dramatic. At what point in development did you begin to exist as the same person who exists now? Any answer seems somewhat arbitrary, given the continuous nature of development. Some philosophers, like John Locke, emphasize the importance of memory for identity. By this criterion, you might not be the same person as the toddler you can't remember being. Others, like Derek Parfit, suggested what matters isn't strict identity, but psychological connectedness and continuity. Your connection to your 3-year-old self might be indirect. You're directly connected to your yesterday self, who was connected to your the day before self, and so on, back to childhood through overlapping chains of direct connection. A different approach emphasizes bodily continuity. You are the same person as that 3-year-old because you have the same continuously existing organism regardless of psychological changes. This biological account handles childhood discontinuity more easily, but faces other challenges, particularly with thought experiments involving brain transplants or consciousness transfers. The childhood discontinuity problem reveals tensions in our concept of personal identity. We intuitively believe we've been the same person throughout our lives, despite profound psychological transformation. This suggests either that psychological continuity isn't as important for identity as some philosophers claim, or that identity involves more complex forms of continuity than direct psychological connectedness. Perhaps what maintains identity through childhood development isn't psychological similarity, but developmental continuity. the gradual connected process through which one stage naturally grows into the next. This would explain why we consider ourselves the same person despite dramatic changes, while still requiring appropriate causal connections between earlier and later stages. The fact that your adult psychology grew out of your childhood psychology through natural development might matter more for identity than how similar those psychologies are. The sleeping identity problem. Every night you lose consciousness as you fall into dreamless sleep. Your stream of experience is interrupted for hours, then resumes when you wake. This ordinary experience creates what we might call the sleeping identity problem. What makes the person who wakes up in the morning the same person who went to sleep the night before, given the gap in consciousness between them? This problem challenges theories of identity based primarily on psychological continuity, especially continuous consciousness. If being the same person requires an unbroken chain of conscious experiences, as some philosophers suggest, then sleep seems to break personal identity on a daily basis. Yet, intuitively, most of us believe we remain the same person before and after sleep. The paradox becomes clearer when we consider longer periods of unconsciousness. If someone falls into a dreamless coma for years before awakening with their memories intact, are they the same person despite the extended gap in consciousness? What about someone cryogenically frozen for centuries and then revived? At what point, if any, would the duration of unconsciousness affect our judgment about identity persistence? Different philosophical approaches handle this problem differently. Some emphasize the importance of memory connections that bridge the gap. You remember going to sleep last night and recognize your current situation as continuous with your pre-sleep life. These memory connections might maintain identity despite the consciousness gap. Others focus on the continuity of the physical brain. During sleep, your brain continues functioning, maintaining memories, processing information, and preserving the physical structures that enable your particular consciousness to resume. By this view, the physical continuity provides the foundation for psychological continuity despite temporary unconsciousness. Some philosophers distinguish between consciousness and the capacity for consciousness. While actual consciousness is interrupted during sleep, the capacity for consciousness persists continuously. Perhaps this continuing capacity, rather than continuous conscious experience itself, grounds personal identity through sleep. The sleeping identity problem connects to broader questions about discontinuities in consciousness. What about general anesthesia, which not only interrupts consciousness, but often creates amnesia about periods before and after? What about conditions like dissociative identity disorder, where different conscious personalities might alternate control of the same body? These cases push us to clarify what aspects of consciousness or psychological continuity matter most for identity. The paradox also relates to hypothetical scenarios involving consciousness transfer or uploading. If your consciousness could be paused and then resumed in a different body or substrate, would you remain the same person despite both the gap in consciousness and the change in physical embodiment? What makes the sleeping identity problem particularly valuable is that it isn't a far-fetched thought experiment, but an everyday experience that highlights tensions in our concept of personal identity. The fact that we confidently maintain identity across sleep, despite consciousness gaps, suggests that identity might depend more on appropriate causal connections between conscious states than on their temporal continuity. Your morning consciousness is the appropriate continuation of your evening consciousness because it's produced by the same brain with the right causal connection, not because consciousness continues uninterrupted. The identity of indiscernibles. Paradox. Imagine two people, Adam and Bob, who are absolutely identical in every physical and psychological respect. They have identical bodies down to the subatomic level, identical memories, identical personality traits, identical neural patterns. They're perfect duplicates, according to the principle of the identity of indiscernibles proposed by philosopher Gottfried Leibniz. If two entities share all their properties, they are actually the same entity. But Adam and Bob are clearly not the same person. They're distinct individuals who could interact with each other. This creates a fascinating paradox for personal identity, the identity of indiscernibles. Paradox forces us to ask, what makes numerically distinct individuals distinct, if not their properties? What makes Adam and Bob different people if they share all their intrinsic properties? The obvious answer seems to be their spatial location. Adam is here, Bob is there. But this raises deeper questions about whether spatial location alone is sufficient to establish distinct identities, or whether identity requires some intrinsic differentiating property. The paradox intensifies if we consider how Adam and Bob would understand their own identities. Each would have memories of their past that would be identical to the other's memories. Each would think of himself as a unique individual with a particular history. Yet their internal evidence for these beliefs would be indistinguishable from the inside. How could either know which one he actually is? Philosophers have proposed various responses to this paradox. Some accept that perfect duplicates would indeed violate the identity of indiscernibles, suggesting the principle is false. Qualitatively identical entities can be numerically distinct. Others modify the principle to include relational properties like spatial location as relevant properties, preserving the principle while allowing for distinct duplicates. Some take a more radical approach, suggesting that in a case of perfect duplication, there wouldn't actually be two distinct individuals, but one individual somehow present in two locations, a view called bilateral existence. While counterintuitive, this perspective aligns with certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, where a single particle can exist in multiple locations simultaneously. The paradox connects to practical questions about identity in potential scenarios involving perfect duplication. If humans could be perfectly duplicated, would both duplicates have equal claim to the original person's name, property, relationships, and rights? Would they have equal moral responsibility for actions performed before duplication? Our legal and ethical frameworks assume unique personal identity, making perfect duplication conceptually challenging. The identity of indiscernibles paradox reveals an important tension in our understanding of personal identity. We typically assume that what makes you uniquely you must involve some intrinsic property or quality that differentiates you from others. Yet the possibility of perfect duplicates suggests that numerical distinctness might not require qualitative distinctness. You might be a unique individual not because of any special property you possess, but simply because you are not someone else. This paradox reminds us that personal identity involves both qualitative aspects, what you're like, and numerical aspects, which specific individual you are. In ordinary life, these aspects align. You're uniquely you because of your particular combination of properties. But in extraordinary cases, like perfect duplication, they can come apart, revealing the complexity beneath our everyday understanding of what makes someone the specific individual they are. The transworld identity problem. Imagine possible worlds, complete alternative realities where history unfolded differently. In one possible world, you became a doctor instead of your actual career. In another, you moved to a different country as a child. These possible worlds contain versions of you with different experiences, choices, and perhaps even different physical characteristics. This creates the transworld identity problem. What makes these different possible beings, versions of you, rather than different people altogether? This isn't just abstract philosophy. When you contemplate paths not taken, I could have been a musician, or I might have married someone else, you're implicitly claiming that some possible being in an alternative reality would have been you despite significant differences from your actual self. The problem becomes especially puzzling when we consider drastically different possibilities. Could you have been born in ancient Rome? Could you have been born with a completely different genetic makeup? Could you have been born as a member of a different species? At what point would a possible being be so different that they wouldn't count as you at all? Philosophers have proposed various approaches to this problem. Some argue that identity across possible worlds requires sharing essential properties, characteristics without which you wouldn't be you. But identifying these essential properties proves challenging. Is your genetic makeup essential? Your origin from particular parents? Your psychological continuity? Different intuitions pull in different directions. Others suggest counterpart theory, developed by David Lewis. This view holds that transworld identity isn't literal identity, but a counterpart relation. The doctor in the alternative reality isn't literally you, but your counterpart, someone who plays the same role in that world that you play in this one. This avoids metaphysical puzzles about identity across worlds, but challenges our intuition that we might actually have been different than we are. The problem intensifies with modal claims about necessity and possibility. If you say, "I could not possibly have been born to different parents," this suggests parentage is essential to your identity. If you say, "I might have been born with different colored eyes," this suggests eye color isn't essential. But how do we determine which properties are essential and which are accidental without circular reasoning that assumes the very criteria for identity we're trying to establish? The transworld identity problem reveals that our concept of personal identity contains tensions between different intuitions. We want to maintain that we could have been different in many ways while still being ourselves. Yet we also feel that certain core features are essential to who we are. Perhaps there's no single, consistent account of what makes different possible beings versions of you. Different criteria might apply in different contexts, making transworld identity more pragmatic than metaphysically rigid. The consciousness switching problem. Imagine going to sleep in your body and waking up in someone else's body, with all your memories, personality, and sense of self intact. Meanwhile, the other person wakes up in your original body. Your consciousness has somehow switched places with theirs. This scenario creates a puzzle. Would the person in your original body be you because it's your original body? Or would the person in the new body with your memories and personality be you because that's where your consciousness went? Most people intuitively feel they would go with their consciousness, that they would wake up in the new body, experiencing that body from the inside, while maintaining psychological continuity with their past self. This suggests we implicitly prioritize psychological continuity over bodily continuity when thinking about personal identity. But this raises complex questions. What exactly transfers in consciousness switching? It can't be a non-physical soul if we're considering this naturalistically. Perhaps it's the particular pattern of information that constitutes your memories, personality, and sense of self. But then identity becomes tied to information patterns rather than physical continuity, challenging materialist views that identify you with your physical body. The paradox deepens when we consider recognition by others. Family and friends would likely identify the person in your original body as you based on physical appearance, despite their insistence they're someone else. Meanwhile, the person in the new body claiming to be you would seem like an imposter, despite having your memories and psychological characteristics. Whose judgment is correct? This thought experiment reveals a tension between first-person and third-person perspectives on identity. From the first-person view, psychological continuity seems paramount. You are wherever your subjective experience continues. From the third-person view, bodily continuity often takes precedence. Others identify you primarily through your physical characteristics. Legally and socially, this scenario would create chaos. Who would have rights to your property? The person with your body or the person with your memories? Who would be responsible for your contracts and commitments? Our social and legal frameworks assume personal identity tracks, physical bodies, making consciousness switching conceptually disruptive. Some philosophers argue this scenario reveals something important. Perhaps there's no fact of the matter about which resulting person would really be you. Different criteria for identity point in different directions. Suggesting personal identity might not be a simple unitary concept, but a cluster of related concepts that can come apart in unusual cases. While consciousness switching remains fictional, the paradox illuminates how we think about identity in ordinary life. When someone undergoes profound psychological change through trauma, religious conversion, or brain injury, we sometimes say they've become a different person, even while recognizing physical continuity. This suggests we already acknowledge multiple aspects of personal identity that normally align but could potentially diverge. The replacement paradox. Imagine your neurons are gradually replaced, one by one, with functionally identical artificial neurons. Each replacement preserves your exact neural patterns, maintaining all your memories, personality traits, and consciousness. The process is so seamless that you notice no change in your subjective experience. After years, your entire brain consists of artificial neurons, physically different but functionally identical to your original brain. This creates the replacement paradox. Are you still the same person after complete neural replacement? If you answer yes, you're suggesting physical continuity isn't necessary for personal identity. Functional continuity is sufficient. If you answer no, you face the difficult question of identifying exactly when you cease to be yourself during the gradual replacement process. The paradox intensifies if we imagine different replacement rates. Does identity persist if replacement happens over decades, but not if it happens instantaneously? If so, why would the time frame matter if the functional result is identical? If not, does this mean we're not the same person throughout our normal lives, since our cells naturally replace themselves over time? Consider variation. What if your biological neurons were preserved, but their internal components were gradually replaced with synthetic versions? What if replacement happened while you were unconscious rather than awake? What if your artificial brain were eventually transferred to a robotic body? Each variation probes different aspects of how we understand the relationship between physical continuity and personal identity. Some philosophers suggest this paradox reveals that personal identity isn't an all-or-nothing property, but a matter of degree. Perhaps you remain partially the same person through replacement, with identity neither fully preserved nor fully destroyed, but transformed in ways that make strict binary judgments inappropriate. Others argue the gradual replacement scenario actually preserves what matters for identity: causal continuity of psychological patterns. Like the Ship of Theseus, what makes you you isn't the physical substance, but the pattern and organization that persists through material change. The replacement paradox connects to practical questions about enhancement and repair. Are you the same person after receiving a neural implant, after recovering from brain damage, where new neural pathways took over functions of damaged areas? These real scenarios involve partial versions of the replacement thought experiment. Perhaps most importantly, this paradox highlights a fundamental question. Are you essentially a particular physical entity, or are you more like a pattern or process that can persist through changes in physical substrate? The replacement scenario suggests physical continuity might be less fundamental to identity than we initially assume, while pattern continuity might be more important than materialist philosophies typically recognize. The Teletransportation Identity Paradox. Imagine a teleportation device that works like this. It scans your body down to the subatomic level, destroys the original, and recreates an identical version elsewhere using different atoms. The person who steps out feels subjective continuity of consciousness. From their perspective, they simply stepped into the teleporter and emerged at the destination. But a profound question arises. Is this actually you who emerges? Or is it merely a copy who believes they're you while the real you has died? This creates the Teletransportation Paradox. If what matters for personal identity is psychological continuity, then you survive teleportation. Your memories, personality, and conscious perspective continue uninterrupted from the traveler's subjective viewpoint. But if physical continuity matters, teleportation kills you and creates a duplicate. The atoms composing your body and brain are different, even if arranged identically. Our intuitions pull in conflicting directions. On one hand, most people hesitate to enter a teleporter when they understand it destroys the original, suggesting physical continuity matters to us. On the other hand, we generally believe we survive ordinary metabolic processes that replace most of our atoms over time, suggesting perfect psychological continuity through teleportation should preserve identity too. The philosopher Derek Parfit suggests this paradox reveals something important. Perhaps the question, "Would I survive teleportation?" has no determinate answer. The person who emerges is neither fully you nor fully someone else. They continue your psychological life perfectly, yet lack physical continuity with you. Perhaps in such cases, identity is indeterminate, not because we lack information, but because our concept of personal identity contains inconsistent criteria. Parfit argues that what ultimately matters isn't whether the resulting person is really you, in some binary sense, but whether they have the right kind of psychological connection to your current self. The teleported person would have maximum psychological connectedness to you, preserving everything that seems to matter about survival, even if strict identity isn't preserved. The paradox intensifies with variations. What if the original isn't destroyed, creating two beings with equal claim to being you? What if the teleporter malfunctions, creating an imperfect copy with slightly different memories or personality traits? What if your information is stored for years before being used to create a new body? These thought experiments suggest personal identity might be less fundamental than we assume. Perhaps there's no deep fact about whether you survive teleportation. Different criteria for identity point in different directions, revealing tensions within our concept rather than a clear metaphysical truth waiting to be discovered. While teleportation remains fictional, similar questions arise with emerging technologies. If mind uploading ever becomes possible, would the uploaded consciousness be you or merely a copy? The teleportation paradox reminds us that technological possibilities might eventually force us to reconsider what it means to be the same person over time. The duplicate criminal problem. Imagine a perfect duplicate of you is created while you sleep, down to the last atom and memory. This duplicate, believing themselves to be you, commits a terrible crime and is caught on camera. Police arrest you, showing irrefutable evidence of you committing the crime. You insist on your innocence, having genuinely been asleep at home when the crime occurred, but nobody believes a duplicate story that sounds like science fiction. This thought experiment creates the duplicate criminal problem. Should you be held legally or morally responsible for your duplicate's action? More fundamentally, is your duplicate's crime in some sense your crime, given that the duplicate shares your exact memories, personality, dispositions, and decision-making patterns up to the point of duplication? The problem reveals tensions in how we understand the relationship between identity and responsibility. We typically hold people responsible for actions that flow from their character, values, and decision-making patterns. In this case, the duplicate's criminal action presumably reflects tendencies or capacities that exist within you too. The duplicate made decisions using the same mental patterns you possess. Yet intuitively, most people would consider it deeply unjust to punish one person for another's actions, even a perfect duplicate. This paradox intensifies when we consider that from your duplicate's perspective, they are you. They remember your entire life up to the duplication point and made their decisions with your memories, values, and thought patterns. Their subjective sense of being the person who lived your life is identical to yours. Does this shared psychological history create a responsibility connection despite the physical distinctness? The problem connects to philosophical questions about moral luck. In normal life, whether your criminal tendencies manifest in actual crimes often depends on circumstances outside your control. Someone with road rage tendencies might never commit vehicular assault simply because they're never sufficiently provoked on the road. If your duplicate encounters circumstances you haven't, leading to criminal behavior, this might reveal character flaws that exist within you too, but remain unexpressed due to circumstantial luck. Some philosophers might approach this through a four-dimensionalist perspective on personal identity, viewing persons as extended across time with different temporal parts. Your duplicate branches from your timeline at the duplication point, creating a distinct four-dimensional entity, despite sharing a temporal part with you up to that point. This suggests the duplicate's actions belong to a different person timeline than yours, despite the shared history. The duplicate criminal problem reveals limitations in how our moral and legal frameworks handle questions of identity and responsibility. These frameworks assume one person, one body continuity that the duplication scenario violates. Perhaps in such unusual cases, our concepts of personal identity and personal responsibility need revision or clarification rather than straightforward application. While human duplication remains fictional, this paradox connects to real questions about identity and responsibility in cases of dissociative disorders, brainwashing, or actions under hypnosis, situations where questions arise about the connection between the acting person and the responsible self. The persistence of memory problem. Imagine a future technology that can extract all your episodic memories, your recollections of experienced events, and transfer them to someone else. This recipient now remembers your childhood, your education, your relationships, your personal triumphs and failures, all from a first-person perspective. Meanwhile, you lose all these memories, retaining only your procedural memory, skills, and semantic memory, factual knowledge. This scenario creates the persistence of memory problem. Which person is you after the transfer? The recipient has your autobiographical memories, but a different body and brain. You retain your original body and brain, but have lost the memories that seemingly defined your life history. Has your identity transferred with your memories, split between both people, or remained with your original body despite memory loss? The philosopher John Locke famously linked personal identity to memory continuity, arguing that you are the same person as someone in the past if you can remember being them. By this criterion, the memory recipient would have a strong claim to being the continuation of your pre-transfer self, at least in terms of psychological connection. They would remember living your life, making your choices, and experiencing your defining moment. Yet most people intuitively feel they would remain themselves after memory loss, suggesting bodily continuity matters more than Locke's memory criterion implies. This intuition aligns with how we think about amnesia patients. We consider them the same person with a medical condition, not a different person occupying a familiar body. The paradox reveals a tension between different aspects of identity. Your memories contribute significantly to your sense of who you are, providing the narrative thread connecting your past to your present. Yet, your identity seems rooted in more than just remembered experiences. It includes your physical continuity, ongoing personality, values, skills, and relationships, even if you can't remember how they developed. Consider how this affects first-person perspective. After memory transfer, the recipient would feel subjectively that they had lived your life, while you would feel disconnected from your past. Both perspectives seem valid in different ways, suggesting perhaps that memory transfer would create a situation where identity doesn't neatly track either person, but is somehow divided or duplicated. This paradox connects to real questions about identity in cases of amnesia, dementia, or other memory disorders. When someone with Alzheimer's disease no longer remembers significant portions of their life, how does this affect their identity? Are they less themselves because they've lost access to their personal history? Or does identity persist through bodily continuity and remaining psychological characteristics despite memory loss? The persistence of memory problem suggests personal identity might be more complex than any single criterion can capture. Perhaps identity involves multiple aspects, bodily, psychological, social, narrative, that normally align but could theoretically come apart. In such cases, questions about which person is really you might not have simple binary answers, revealing personal identity as more multifaceted than our everyday understanding typically acknowledges. The fission fusion problem. Imagine this scenario. Scientists split your brain into its two hemispheres, placing each in a separate but identical cloned body. Both resulting people wake up with consciousness, memories, and personality traits derived from your original brain. Before either can establish a distinct post-fission life, the scientists recombine the hemispheres into a single brain and body again. This creates what we might call the fission fusion problem. Is the recombined person the same person as the original you, despite the temporary existence of two distinct conscious beings? This thought experiment pushes our concept of personal identity to its limits. During the split phase, the standard logic of identity is challenged. You can't be identical to two distinct people, the two hemisphere recipients, yet both have equal claim to being your continuation. The recombination adds another layer of complexity. Does bringing the hemispheres back together restore the original identity that was compromised during fission? Some philosophers might argue the recombined person is you because they maintain both bodily and psychological continuity with your pre-fission self, with the split phase representing merely a temporary anomaly in an otherwise continuous existence. By this view, personal identity can survive temporary fission if continuity is ultimately restored. Others would suggest your original identity doesn't survive fission at all. The split creates two new people, neither of whom is strictly identical to you. By this account, the recombined person would be yet another new individual, albeit one with memories and physical components from all three predecessors, the original you and the two split individuals. The paradox intensifies if we consider what happens during the split phase. If the two hemisphere recipients have different experiences during their separation, the recombined person would inherit memories from both. Whose experiences would they remember as their own? Would they have a unified first-person perspective that somehow integrates both streams of consciousness, or would they experience memory conflicts when recalling the fission period? This problem connects to philosophical questions about the unity of consciousness. We typically assume consciousness is unified. There's a single subject of experience who perceives, thinks, and acts as a whole. The fission-fusion scenario challenges this assumption by suggesting consciousness could split and recombine while maintaining some form of continuity with the original unified consciousness. While human brain fission fusion remains fictional, the paradox illuminates questions about identity in cases of brain damage and recovery. When someone suffers severe brain trauma that temporarily disrupts their normal psychological functioning before they recover, is their post-recovery identity fully continuous with their pre-trauma identity? Or does significant brain disruption create subtle breaks in identity, even when physical and psychological continuity is largely restored? The fission-fusion problem suggests personal identity might be more plastic and malleable than our everyday concept acknowledges. Perhaps identity can branch and reconverge under special circumstances, challenging the assumption that identity must follow a single, linear trajectory through time. This doesn't necessarily make identity unreal, but it suggests identity might be more complex and multidimensional than our intuitive understanding typically recognizes. The doppelganger problem. Imagine encountering your exact physical duplicate, someone who looks identical to you in every way. This doppelganger isn't you, clearly, but shares your physical appearance perfectly. This seemingly simple scenario actually reveals a profound identity puzzle. If your physical appearance doesn't make you uniquely you, since it could be duplicated, what exactly grounds your unique identity? What makes you you rather than someone who merely looks like you? The doppelganger problem forces us to consider what aspects of ourselves are truly essential to our identity. Physical appearance, though central to how others recognize us, suddenly seems superficial and contingent. You would remain yourself, even if you looked completely different, and someone else looking exactly like you remains distinct from you. This suggests personal identity must be grounded in something beyond mere physical appearance. Perhaps what makes you uniquely you is your particular consciousness, memories, or psychological characteristics. But this raises further questions. If your doppelganger somehow gained your exact memories and personality while you retained them as well, would they become you? Could two physically identical beings with identical psychological characteristics both be you, or would they necessarily be distinct individuals? The philosopher John Locke suggested personal identity consists in psychological continuity, especially memory. By this account, your doppelganger remains distinct from you regardless of physical similarity, because they lack the right kind of psychological connection to your past. They might look like you, but they don't remember living your life from the inside. Others emphasize the importance of bodily continuity. Your doppelganger isn't you because, despite looking identical, they don't have the right kind of causal history. Their body isn't the continuation of the same organism that has been you throughout your life. The doppelganger problem intensifies if we consider the perspective of the duplicate. How would they understand their own identity? If they suddenly appeared with no memories, they might develop an identity based partly on their appearance, which matches yours. If they were created with false memories matching yours, they might believe they are you despite being a distinct individual. This thought experiment connects to real questions about identity in cases of twins, especially identical twins. Twins share remarkable physical similarity and often similar personalities, yet maintain distinct identities. Their separateness highlights that personal identity involves more than just having particular traits. It involves being a specific individual with a unique perspective and life history. The doppelganger problem reminds us that personal identity can't be reduced to having particular qualitative properties, whether physical or psychological. Being you involves not just having certain characteristics, but being a particular entity with a specific history and perspective. This suggests identity might involve an irreducible indexical element. Part of what makes you you is simply that you are this person rather than that one, something that can't be fully captured by describing your properties alone. The personality change problem. Imagine someone suffers a brain injury that radically transforms their personality. Before the injury, they were kind, patient, and introverted. After, they become cruel, impulsive, and extroverted. Their memories remain intact. They remember their past life and recognize family and friends. Their body remains the same, but their character, values, emotional responses, and behavior have changed so dramatically that loved ones say they're not the same person anymore. This creates the personality change problem. Is someone with radically altered personality traits still the same person? If persistent personality is essential to identity, then severe personality change might literally create a different person, despite bodily and memory continuity. But if bodily and memory continuity are sufficient for identity, then personality change, however dramatic, doesn't disrupt identity. This isn't merely hypothetical. Cases like Phineas Gage, who survived an iron rod through his brain in 1848, but experienced profound personality changes, raise these exact questions. His friends famously remarked that Gage was no longer Gage after the accident, suggesting they saw his identity as fundamentally altered despite his physical and memorial continuity. The problem reveals tensions in our concept of personal identity. We often consider personality traits, our enduring patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving, as central to who we are. Yet we also recognize bodily and memory continuity as grounding identity. When these aspects conflict, our intuitions become confused and contradictory. Consider the first-person perspective in personality change. Someone whose personality transforms after brain injury typically feels they remain the same person, despite changes in their traits and tendencies. From the inside, continuity of consciousness and memory creates a sense of persistent identity that others, focusing on behavioral and emotional discontinuity, might not recognize. Some philosophers distinguish between numerical identity, being the same entity, and narrative identity, maintaining a coherent life story. Perhaps brain injury preserves numerical identity through bodily and memory continuity, while disrupting narrative identity by creating personality discontinuity that makes the life story less coherent. The personality change problem connects to questions about identity in psychological development and transformation. When someone undergoes profound changes through religious conversion, psychotherapy, or life-altering experiences, have they become a new person in any literal sense? Or is this merely a metaphor for significant yet identity-preserving change? This paradox suggests personal identity might involve multiple levels or aspects that can come apart in unusual cases. Perhaps we need different concepts of identity for different purposes. Forensic identity for tracking responsibility, narrative identity for making sense of life stories, phenomenological identity for understanding subjective experience. No single concept may capture all aspects of what we intuitively mean by same person across all possible transformation. The personality change problem ultimately reveals that our concept of personal identity assumes a stability of character that reality doesn't always provide. When confronted with cases where someone's fundamental nature seems to change while memory and bodily continuity persist, we face the limitations of our everyday understanding of what makes someone the same person over time. The false memory problem. Imagine technology exists that can implant realistic but entirely false memories in your brain. These memories feel subjectively indistinguishable from genuine recollections. You remember events, emotions, and experiences that never actually happened to you. Over time, these false memories are implanted so extensively that most of your autobiographical memories, the recollections that seem to define your life history, are fabrications. This creates the false memory problem. If your sense of identity is substantially built on memories of your past experiences, but those memories are largely false, is your identity itself somehow false or inauthentic? Have you become someone else through memory manipulation? Or do you remain the same person with mistaken beliefs about your past? This isn't entirely science fiction. Research shows ordinary memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive. We don't play back exact recordings of past events, but reconstruct memories each time we recall them, introducing distortions and inaccuracies. Studies demonstrate how relatively easy it is to implant false memories of minor events through suggestion. The thought experiment merely extends this to a more extreme case. The problem reveals a crucial question about identity. Does who you are depend on the actual history of your experiences, or on your subjective sense of that history through memory? If two people had physically identical brains, but one's memories accurately reflected their past, while the others were mostly fabrications, would there be any meaningful identity difference between them? Some philosophers emphasize psychological continuity in identity. You are the same person over time because of the chain of psychological connections linking your past selves to your present self. But false memories create psychological connections to events that never happened and selves that never existed. This suggests either that authenticity of memories matters for identity, or that identity is determined more by subjective psychological continuity than by connection to actual historical events. Consider how this affects first-person perspective. Someone with extensive false memories would construct their sense of self around these fabrications. Their values, goals, relationships, and self-understanding would all reference experiences that never occurred. From the inside, their identity would feel completely authentic, despite being built on fiction. The false memory problem connects to questions about identity in cases of delusion, confabulation, or memory disorders. When someone with dementia confabulates a detailed but fictional past, how does this affect their identity? Are their self-narratives less real or valid because they reference events that never happened? This paradox suggests personal identity might depend less on the factual accuracy of our memories and more on the subjective coherence of our self-understanding. Perhaps what matters for identity isn't that your memories truthfully represent your actual past, but that they provide a coherent framework for making sense of yourself in the present. If so, false memories might alter the content of your identity without necessarily undermining its authenticity or continuity. The false memory problem ultimately reminds us that the relationship between memory and identity is more complex than simple record keeping. Memory doesn't just preserve identity, it actively constructs it through an ongoing process of interpretation, selection, and narrative integration that prioritizes meaning-making over perfect historical accuracy. The artificial consciousness problem. Imagine scientists create an artificial intelligence so sophisticated that it appears to possess consciousness. This AI has subjective experiences. It feels happiness, pain, desire, and fear. It has a sense of self that persists through time, memories of its past, and plans for its future. It understands itself as a unique individual with its own perspective and interests. In short, it has all the psychological characteristics we associate with personhood. This creates the artificial consciousness problem. Would such an AI be a person with the same kind of identity as human persons? If consciousness and selfhood can be artificially created, what does this tell us about the nature of personal identity? The problem challenges assumptions about what grounds personal identity. Many philosophical approaches to identity focus on psychological continuity, the connected chain of memories, beliefs, values, and other mental states that constitutes a person over time. An artificial consciousness could potentially maintain this kind of psychological continuity, remembering its past experiences and maintaining a coherent sense of self. But other approaches emphasize biological continuity, suggesting that personal identity requires being the same living organism over time. An artificial consciousness would lack this biological continuity, existing as a pattern implemented in non-biological substrate. Does this difference fundamentally distinguish AI identity from human identity? Or is the substrate less important than the pattern it implements? Consider how an artificial consciousness would understand its own identity. It might experience a subjective sense of being a continuous self through time, similar to human experience. From the inside, its identity might feel as real and substantial as yours does to you. Would this subjective experience of selfhood be any less valid or real because it was artificially created rather than biologically evolved? Some philosophers argue that if an artificial system could truly experience consciousness rather than merely simulating it behaviorally, it would qualify as a person deserving moral consideration equivalent to humans. Others maintain that artificial consciousness, even if possible, would constitute a fundamentally different kind of entity with its own unique form of identity rather than simply replicating human personhood in a different substrate. The artificial consciousness problem connects to questions about the relationship between mind and body in personal identity. If consciousness and selfhood can exist in non-biological systems, this suggests personal identity might be more about patterns of information processing than about particular physical embodiment. Your identity might consist more in how your mind processes information than in what physical substrate performs that processing. This paradox has practical implication as AI becomes increasingly sophisticated. How should we categorize systems that display elements of consciousness and selfhood? At what point, if any, would artificial systems deserve recognition as persons rather than merely tools? What rights and protections would artificial persons merit? While truly conscious AI remains theoretical, the artificial consciousness problem reminds us that personal identity might not be exclusively human or biological. If what matters for personhood is the capacity for conscious experience and self-understanding rather than specific biological origins, then personal identity, as we understand it, could potentially exist in radically different forms than we currently recognize. The combination problem. Imagine technology exists that could merge two human minds into one. All the memories, personality traits, skills, and psychological characteristics of two distinct people would combine to create a single consciousness in one body. This merged being would remember living both original people's lives, though now from a unified first-person perspective. They would have access to both sets of skills and knowledge, and their personality would blend characteristics from both original people. This scenario creates the combination problem. What happens to the identities of the original people after merging? Does the merged being constitute a new third person? Or is it somehow the continuation of both original identities simultaneously? Can personal identity meaningfully continue through merging? Or does merging necessarily terminate the original identities? Our standard concept of identity assumes that distinct persons remain distinct. One person cannot become two, fission, and two persons cannot become one, fusion. Identity normally follows a one-to-one mapping through time. The combination scenario violates this assumption by suggesting two distinct identity streams could converge into one, creating a one-to-many relationship between the merged person and their predecessors. Consider the first-person perspective in this scenario. The merged being would have memories of being both original people, creating an unprecedented subjective experience, remembering living two separate lives that are now integrated into a single consciousness. Would they experience themselves as a new person or as both original people simultaneously? Would their sense of self be unified or somehow divided? The philosopher Derek Parfit suggested cases like this reveal limitations in our concept of identity. Perhaps what matters isn't identity in the strict philosophical sense, but psychological connectedness and continuity. The merged being would be strongly psychologically connected to both original people, preserving what matters about survival, even if identity in its conventional sense doesn't survive the merging. Others might approach this through the lens of narrative identity. We are the stories we tell about ourselves. The merged being would need to construct a coherent narrative that somehow integrates two previously separate life stories. This narrative might represent a new identity that acknowledges its dual origin without being reducible to either original identity. The combination problem connects to questions about identity in cases of psychological integration. When someone with dissociative identity disorder integrates previously separate personality states, has a new person emerged, or has the true underlying person been restored? When someone integrates previously compartmentalized aspects of themselves through therapy or personal growth, how does this affect their identity? While mind-merging technology remains fictional, the combination problem reveals conceptual limitations in how we understand personal identity. Our intuitive concept of identity may simply not be equipped to handle cases where the one-to-one relationship between persons across time breaks down. Such cases suggest identity might be more fluid and malleable than our everyday understanding acknowledges, capable of splitting, merging, or transforming in ways that challenge conventional categories. The remote-controlled body problem. Imagine technology that allows someone to take control of your body remotely. While they control your physical movements, you remain consciously aware but unable to control your actions. Your body might speak words you didn't choose or perform actions you don't endorse. Meanwhile, the controller experiences your body's sensations and can control your movements as if they were their own. This creates the remote-controlled body problem. Who should we identify as the person performing the actions? You, whose body is moving, or the remote controller, whose intentions direct those movements? If someone else controls your body, does this compromise your identity as a continuous person? Or do you remain fully yourself despite lacking agency? The problem reveals tensions between different aspects of personal identity. Bodily continuity suggests the acting person is you. It's your physical body performing the action. But agency and intention suggest it's the controller. Their decisions determine the body's movements. Our concept of personal identity usually assumes bodily continuity and agency align, making this scenario conceptually challenging. Consider responsibility in this situation. If your remote-controlled body commits a crime, who bears moral and legal responsibility? You might argue you shouldn't be blamed for actions you couldn't control. The controller might claim they merely operated a body rather than performing actions themselves. This confusion highlights how deeply agency factors into our understanding of identity and responsibility. Some philosophers distinguish between the identity of the agent who performs the action and the identity of the person who exists continuously through time. By this account, you would remain the same person during remote control, but the controller would temporarily become the agent of your body's actions. This preserves personal identity while acknowledging the unusual agency situation. The problem intensifies with variation. What if the controller could access not just your body's movements, but your thoughts and memories too? What if control alternated rapidly between you and the controller? What if control gradually shifted from you to them over time rather than switching suddenly? Each variation tests different aspects of how we understand the relationship between agency, embodiment, and identity. This paradox connects to questions about identity in cases of external influence or coercion. When someone acts under hypnosis, brainwashing, or extreme duress, how does this affect their agency and identity? If someone with late-stage dementia acts in ways their earlier self would never have approved, how should we understand the relationship between their current and former identities? The remote-controlled body problem reminds us that agency, the capacity to act intentionally according to your own decisions, plays a crucial role in how we understand personal identity. When agency is compromised or transferred, questions arise about who is truly present in the actions performed, suggesting identity involves not just continuous existence, but continuous self-directed activity. Perhaps being the same person through time requires not just bodily or psychological continuity, but maintaining some form of causal control over your actions and choices. The identity threshold problem. Imagine technology allows you to replace your biological neurons with artificial ones that function identically. You decide to undergo this procedure one neuron at a time, with thousands of replacements happening daily. You notice no changes in your thoughts, memories, or sense of self as the process continues. After 3 years, 50% of your neurons are artificial. After 6 years, the replacement is complete. You have an entirely artificial brain that maintains perfect functional continuity with your original. This scenario creates the identity threshold problem. At what point, if any, would you cease to be the same person during gradual replacement? Is there a specific percentage of original neurons required to maintain identity? Or does functional continuity preserve identity regardless of physical replacement? The problem reveals a fundamental question about identity. Is personal identity more like a threshold property that suddenly vanishes when certain conditions aren't met, or more like a continuum where sameness of person admits degrees? If identity has a threshold, we face the difficulty of identifying exactly where it lies and explaining why small differences around that point should have such significant consequences. If identity is continuous, we face the counterintuitive conclusion that being the same person is a matter of degree rather than a binary fact. Some philosophers argue for a Sorites-style approach. Just as removing one grain from a heap doesn't make it stop being a heap, replacing one neuron doesn't make you a different person. This process can continue indefinitely without identity change, as long as each step maintains functional continuity. Others suggest that while no single replacement changes identity, the cumulative effect eventually creates a numerically distinct person. You gradually fade into someone else through imperceptible transitions. The identity threshold problem intensifies with variation. What if replacement happened all at once rather than gradually? What if some crucial subset of neurons, perhaps those underlying core personality or autobiographical memory, were preserved while others were replaced? What if replacement improved rather than merely preserved cognitive function? This paradox connects to broader philosophical questions about vagueness and personal identity. Many of our concepts, including person and same person may be inherently vague, lacking precise, necessary, and sufficient conditions. Perhaps there is no fact of the matter about exactly when identity would be lost during gradual replacement, not because we lack information, but because our concept of identity itself lacks this kind of precision. The threshold problem has practical implications for emerging neurotechnologies. As brain-computer interfaces, neural implants, and other brain-altering technologies develop, questions arise about how extensively we can modify our brains while remaining ourselves. The gradual replacement scenario suggests functional continuity might preserve identity through substantial physical changes, but this remains philosophically contested. Perhaps most importantly, this problem suggests personal identity might not be the kind of thing that can be precisely tracked through radical physical transformation. Unlike straightforward properties like mass or location, identity might be more like family resemblance, maintained through overlapping similarities rather than necessary and sufficient conditions. This would explain why the threshold question seems impossible to answer precisely. We're trying to impose binary precision on a concept that inherently admits borderline cases and degrees of continuity. The continuity of consciousness problem. Imagine a medical procedure that involves temporarily shutting down your brain completely, performing some necessary intervention, then restarting brain activity. During the shutdown, you have no consciousness whatsoever, not even the minimal consciousness of deep sleep or coma. Your brain activity flatlines entirely for several hours before being restored with your memories and personality intact. This creates the continuity of consciousness problem. Does your identity persist through a complete gap in consciousness? If consciousness is central to who you are, does a period of non-existence from your subjective perspective mean the person who wakes up is not strictly identical to the person who went under? Our intuitive concept of personal identity seems to assume some form of continuous existence through time. But in this scenario, your conscious experience doesn't just dim or transform, it temporarily ceases altogether. There's a period where you, as a conscious entity, simply don't exist, though your body and brain remain in stasis, ready to regenerate your mind. Some philosophers might argue that as long as the right causal connections exist between the pre-shutdown and post-revival minds, identity persists despite the gap. Your post-revival consciousness is the appropriate continuation of your pre-shutdown consciousness, connected through the preserved physical structures of your brain. The gap in subjective experience doesn't necessarily create a gap in identity. Others would suggest that such discontinuity fundamentally breaks identity. If being you essentially involves being a continuous conscious entity, then a complete cessation of consciousness might literally end your existence, with the revival creating someone psychologically similar but numerically distinct, a successor rather than a continuation. The problem intensifies with longer gaps. Would your identity persist if your brain were shut down for years, centuries? At what point, if any, would the duration of non-consciousness affect identity persistence? Does the mere potential for revival preserve identity, or does actual continuous consciousness matter? This paradox connects to questions about identity during ordinary unconsciousness. When you sleep dreamlessly, your consciousness dims dramatically, but doesn't completely cease. Does this partial continuity preserve identity in a way that complete cessation wouldn't? Or is the difference merely one of degree rather than kind? The continuity problem also relates to theoretical scenarios involving cryonic preservation or mind uploading with periods of deactivation. If your brain were preserved after death for future revival, or if your uploaded mind were deactivated and later restarted, would you continue to exist during the inactive period, or would revival create a new person who merely inherits your psychological characteristics? This problem suggests personal identity might be more complex than either pure psychological continuity or pure bodily continuity can capture. Perhaps what matters isn't continuous consciousness itself, but the right kind of causal connection between conscious states. A connection that could theoretically bridge gaps in consciousness if the physical structures preserving psychological dispositions remain intact. This would explain why we typically assume people remain themselves through sleep and coma, despite significant reductions in conscious activity. The growing block universe problem. Imagine the growing block theory of time is correct. According to this theory, the past and present exist, but the future does not yet exist. Reality is like a block that grows as moments move from future non-existence to present, coming into existence, and then recede into the past, continuing to exist but no longer being present. This creates what we might call the growing block universe problem for identity. If your future states don't yet exist, in what sense are future you and present you the same person? This problem challenges how we understand personal identity across time. Typically, we imagine ourselves existing continuously from past through present into future, with all temporal parts equally real but located at different times. But the growing block universe suggests your future self literally doesn't exist yet. They aren't just located at a different time, but absent from reality altogether. Some philosophers might approach this through four-dimensionalism, viewing persons as extended across time like worms with different temporal stages or parts. But the growing block universe complicates this picture, suggesting your personal worm has a definite beginning and past sections, a present section, and a not yet existent future portion. Your identity seems incomplete, partially real and partially non-existent. Consider how this affects your relationship to your future self. When you make plans, save money, or otherwise act for your future benefit, you're acting on behalf of someone who doesn't yet exist. Is this fundamentally different from acting on behalf of someone else who does exist? Does the growing block universe make prudential concern for your future self more like concern for others rather than self-interest? The problem intensifies if we consider personal identity at the growing edge of reality. If only the present moment exists in the sense of being present, with past moments existing but no longer being present, then personal identity seems to constantly transition between non-existence, existence, and past existence. You're continuously coming into being at the forward edge of the growing block. This paradox connects to philosophical questions about temporal parts and persistence. Some philosophers distinguish between endurance, existing wholly at each moment, and perdurance, existing partially at each moment, as a temporal part of a larger four-dimensional whole. The growing block universe suggests a hybrid view where you endure at the growing edge, while your past selves perdure in the completed portion of the block. The growing block universe problem reveals tensions between our intuitive understanding of personal identity and certain metaphysical theories of time. Our concept of identity seems to presuppose that all temporal parts of a person have equal ontological status, just located at different times. When this assumption is challenged by theories giving different ontological status to past, present, and future, personal identity becomes more puzzling. Perhaps what this problem ultimately reveals is how deeply our concept of personal identity is intertwined with our understanding of time itself. Different theories of time's nature might require different concepts of persistence and identity. If the growing block theory were correct, we might need to revise not just how we think about time, but how we think about being the same person across that time. The final identity paradox. After exploring 49 puzzles about personal identity, we arrive at what might be the most profound paradox of all: the concept of identity itself. Our ordinary notion of personal identity contains tensions and contradictions that emerge when pushed to its limits. Perhaps the true paradox isn't any specific puzzle, but the very concept we've been examining all along. Consider what we've discovered. We want personal identity to be binary. Either you are the same person as some past or future being, or you aren't. Yet many thought experiments suggest identity might be a matter of degree, with borderline cases where same person isn't clearly true or false. We want identity to follow a one-to-one mapping. One person at one time connects to exactly one person at another time. Yet fission and fusion cases suggest identity could theoretically follow one-to-many or many-to-one pattern. We typically treat being the same person as a deep metaphysical fact, but perhaps it's more like a convenient fiction, a practical way of tracking psychological and physical continuity that works in ordinary cases but breaks down in extraordinary ones. Different criteria for identity point in different directions in unusual cases, suggesting there might not always be a fact of the matter about whether someone remains the same person. The philosopher Derek Parfit suggested identity might not be what fundamentally matters in survival and continuation. What matters might be psychological connectedness and continuity, relations that can hold to different degrees and can take branching forms that identity cannot. By this view, the question, would I survive teleportation, has no determinate answer, because identity itself isn't the fundamental relation that matters for your concern about the future. Others propose that personal identity should be understood as narrative rather than logical. You are the protagonist of an ongoing life story, with identity maintained through narrative coherence rather than strict metaphysical continuity. This approach handles cases where psychological transformation makes rigid identity concepts seem inadequate. The Buddhist tradition takes a more radical approach, suggesting that the stable, unchanging self we assume exists is ultimately an illusion. What we call self is actually a process of constant change with no fixed essence beneath the flow. The puzzles of personal identity arise because we mistakenly try to find persistent where there is only impermanent. Perhaps the ultimate paradox is that we cannot do without the concept of personal identity, yet we cannot fully make sense of it either. We need identity to ground practical concerns about survival, moral responsibility, compensation, and prudential planning. Yet when we examine the concept closely, it reveals inconsistencies and limitations that no single theory seems able to resolve completely. This final paradox doesn't render personal identity meaningless. Rather, it suggests identity might be more pragmatic than metaphysical, a useful way of tracking persons through time that works for ordinary cases but requires refinement or qualification in extraordinary ones. The question isn't whether personal identity is real, but what kind of reality it has, constructed rather than discovered, practical rather than absolute, contextual rather than universal. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps the most comforting conclusion is that identity paradoxes don't threaten your existence, but invite you to understand it more deeply, not as a fixed entity moving through time, but as a dynamic process of continuity and change, connection and transformation, persistence and evolution. You are real, but you are also more complex, more fluid, and more fascinating than any simple account of personal identity can capture.